Carl's going to kick us off. We have 30, like every presentation is 30 minutes, questions throughout. So don't hold back. All right.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you. Good morning. I'd like to first just thank the organizers. I'm going to be talking about trade restrictions in permit markets, but just as a sort of starting point, I want to talk about the trend of sort of the growth of environmental permit markets globally, a tension that I think will be familiar to many people in the room. These types of permit markets are a powerful tool and growing. They cover about a fifth of global greenhouse gases. That's not including other types of carbon pricing, like taxes. And about a third of commercial fisheries around the world are in some sort of tradable permit scheme. And just also something that will be familiar to you, economists like them due to the gains from trade. We can cap the aggregate amount of harvest or emissions, distribute permits to firms, allow them to trade, and we will then be able to reallocate production to more profitable firms that will increase the value of the resource overall or minimize the total cost of emitting the cap. But we also know that we also have a sense, I guess, that these markets are not being implemented in places where they would be effective. There's often a lot of political resistance or community resistance to them. And I think broadly speaking, the reason is that many groups get affected by this reallocation of harvests or emissions. And I think the fundamental problem or tension that I kind of want everybody to hold in their heads for this next half hour is that initial allocations only often transfer value to firm owners. You often think that these initial allocations are how to shift lump sum transfers, but in this case, they often only flow to firm owners. But other kinds of people or agents or groups, workers, local communities near power plants, are often left out. And regulators and electorates have other kinds of non-efficiency goals: job protection, increasing employment, and income redistribution. And in response to that, regulators often put in limits to the amount of trading that can happen with permits. And these kinds of restrictions are ubiquitous. They're in water markets, fisheries permit markets, pollution permit markets, and in wetlands trading schemes. And oftentimes are exactly motivated by these kinds of non-efficiency redistributive goals. I'm going to focus on two common types. First is what I call segmentation, where you take firm types, separate them into markets, and don't allow trading between them. And second is what I call production requirements, that once permits are maybe freely allocated, firms are required to harvest or emit some fraction of those permits rather than allowing them to trade. And this creates a kind of trade-off. By limiting trade, you can keep permits with less productive firms. This might create more employment, it might increase income among certain groups, it might keep pollution disparities lower than otherwise. But they come at a cost because you're preventing the most efficient reallocation of production. And broadly speaking, that's what this paper asks: what these restrictions cost and how to think about what they actually achieve. And in doing so, I hope we gotta be able to sort of bring in imperfectly designed markets into this policy debate more rigorously. For example, and to avoid outcomes like US fisheries ended up in the late 90s, where explicitly to, quote, maintain employment and a cherished way of life, the US Congress put a moratorium on permit trading in US fisheries for over 5 years. And so I'm going to focus on balancing the efficiency against the distributional impacts of trading limits in a permit market. And what I think makes this kind of fun is that you have to both compare the gains from trade, the profits generated after trading versus the initial allocation, and then compare that to who gains and who loses and by how much for an existing market with the trading restrictions against a counterfactual market without them. So you're actually comparing two permit market equilibria. And by comparing those equilibria and comparing these two outcomes, you can quantify the cost of redistribution through trading limits. How much does it cost per dollar to shift per dollar of redistribution to low-income workers? How much does it cost in terms of efficiency losses in the market? I'm going to sort of first think about a framework and implement it in Iceland's quota market, its tradable permit scheme for its fisheries, which has both of these designs, a segmented market to protect small boats, and what a 50% production requirement, where boats are required to harvest half of the allocation they're given. And what I think is nice and unique about the Icelandic setting is the ability to both link very detailed harvest data and permit trading data to microdata on workers from tax filings. So for at the individual level, so you can sort of really understand how output decisions affect earnings in the income distribution and employment. First, I'm going to point to some just evidence in the data from the expansion of permit trading that really shows these tensions. It raises efficiency, lowers aggregate labor demand, so aggregate employment, and increases income inequality while doing so. And I'll show some evidence that both these trade restrictions do in fact have some kind of effect. They are distorting production in a real way and seem to target, quote unquote, the right boats. But then I want to point to a model that allows me to actually do this comparison of different permit market equilibria, from which you can see that there are actually kind of interesting roles that each of these restrictions play. That segmentation seems to really protect employment by targeting labor-intensive boats, whereas the production requirement is the one that really leads to income redistribution. And in fact, doing both together, sort of creating these two distortions, actually strictly dominates doing the production requirement alone. It creates more and higher paying employment in fisheries. And so broadly, I think this is connecting a growing literature on assessing the gains from trade in different kinds of permit markets with another broad literature on the distributional impacts of environmental regulation, and sort of even more broadly, maybe these equity concerns in market design that actually sort of are inspired often by an even older literature on redistribution via regulation, thinking about how to compare different types of regulatory environments and understand who gains and at what cost. So first, I want to sort of fix ideas here and think about how do I even assess these kinds of restrictions. So just to start with the most basic setup, you can think of a regulator setting some production cap Q or an emissions cap. Then all the producers receive some free allocation. That's going to be my basis here, such that adds up to this cap. And then they have some characteristics that determine profits at different Qs, at different production levels. They then maximize profits given the permit price. And then they all equalize marginal profits to the permit price. This is why a permit market will maximize aggregate profits or alternatively minimize aggregate costs. And that implicitly defines these permit choice functions. With information on the permit choice function and the permit allocation, you can know exactly who's going to be a net supplier of permits into the market and a net buyer of permits. And together, these things will sum up to create a market clearing price. And here it is. So here's just an example of a permit demand curve and a permit supply curve. This is the gains from trade, which emphasizes that actually the gains from trade depend not only on differences in marginal profits, but also on the initial allocation. Those things together create this area here. And these are the rents that are distributed by free permit allocations. There's an automatic lump sum transfer tool built into the permit market when you freely allocate permits, but crucially, those only go to firm owners. In almost all permit market cases, except for very small ones, they're going to the actual owners of the firms that are emitting or harvesting. But a lot of other groups are affected in this transition to a more efficient production allocation. For example, labor at these firms is just paid some wage or is otherwise paid only out of harvesting production. Or these, in another setting in pollution, I think local communities often come up. They're worried that these permit rules will create undue pollution concentration in marginalized communities, for example. But crucially, this all depends, I think, on being able to link these production outcomes to worker outcomes, right? In the labor case, that there might be rent sharing or some mobility friction, something that generates losses when an individual firm loses production. But at any rate, what can then happen when each permit moves from a low to a high profit boat or a firm? Production will shift to less labor intensive boats at some degree because they're going to be more productive. That's going to create fewer jobs overall, less employment, less labor demand. And in addition, we might think that these more productive firms have higher income workers. And so then earnings will also shift dollar for dollar from low to high income workers overall. But as I mentioned, this is an empirical question. How changes in production map to labor demand and earnings across the income distribution depend on these labor market institutions and the production process at hand. Yes.
Question.
Yeah.
Street workers are is also the owners of the boats who benefit like the profit of the, or are two different things? Like
They are two different things, I think. And so here we do see owner operators, and I sort of treat them fully as owners and being able to get these gains. But there's a huge group of, in this case, of sort of crews that do not own vessels and do not try to participate in permit trading at all.
see, so here the boats is a sort of firm, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah.
So when you say these earnings shifting toward higher income workers, I guess will be the profits going to the more productive firms.
Yes,
and the
exactly.
workers working on those farms, I guess.
And the working of those firms. And exactly, and then it depends sort of how much does it matter? For example, if it's even more clear maybe in an emissions case, right? If a more productive firm is getting more permits to emit, does that necessarily mean something about the earnings workers get in that firm and that's emitting something? It's not clear. You would have to really sort of know how production matches up to sort of remunerative schemes in firms and so on. So that's kind of what I'm thinking about. At any rate, maybe regulators will then want to steer production to blunt these kinds of redistributive losses. Yeah.
A related question.
Yeah.
Do we introduce sort of employment frictions where you're not where you can't let go?
Yeah, so that would be an example of something that would be a friction that either you can't let go of a worker or creates unemployment sort of earnings losses due to sort of searching for a new job. You could imagine that those are the kinds of mobility frictions that could generate losses. That I'm just sort of general. You do see that in the data. But that's an example. So regulators around the world can turn to two kinds of designs. These are not the only ones, but the ones that I'm going to focus on. One is what I'm going to call segmentation, what I mentioned before. They're going to separate permit markets, create two different caps for different firms. And they're mutually exclusive. A firm is at either one. That is going to create two general equilibrium permit prices in each market. And what's the inefficiency? It's going to be that marginal profits are no longer equalized across the entire industry, which you can see in the fact that the permit prices are different. And who's going to sort of win out in this? It's going to be the group that would otherwise net sell to the other group, the less productive market. And in particular, it's going to be labor in that group because they're going to be the ones who benefit when production rises. Firm owners will lose in that market because they would have otherwise wanted to sell those permits and make a profit. The other example is a harvest requirement. Yes.
Is only labor that's immobile, like is labor mobile across the segments?
You can allow labor to be mobile. I think what you can think about this is a sort of reduced form, comparison of these two things. If these workers who are on these less productive firms could find jobs in more productive firms, you wouldn't worry about this. But in fact, there's going to be two things that prevent that. One is that labor demand in aggregate is falling, that these jobs don't exist in this particular industry. But the second thing is these sort of mobility frictions you could imagine. That even if they move to some other sector, they don't kind of find those kinds of jobs. I leave this I let the sort of data focus on this in my setting, but you could imagine modeling that more carefully. The second one is the harvest requirement. Again, you're going to require some fraction. It's usually a fraction of harvest that comes out of your permit allocation. And this is often said, so you either pick the permit choice function, or you pick some bottom line fraction that depends on your allocation. This is a supply constraint. It's going to prevent firms that would sell a lot of their permits from doing so. And that's going to generate an inefficiency. And who wins here? It's those workers on those kinds of firms. They are now fit in firms that are going to produce more, and we think their earnings will increase. And just to kind of bring it back to these figures, these sort of stylized figures, what is this going to look like? Here's now two different market equilibria. What is the inefficiency? It looks a lot like the gains from trade in an international trade setting, right? It's going to be the fact that this was a net selling group, and these profits have now been lost because the permit market has fallen, the permit price has fallen, and they cannot trade to this group here who would otherwise buy it and produce more. Here, we're going to just rotate, this acts to rotate the permit supply curve upward and creating this kind of inefficiency here. But it depends exactly, because it depends on these curves, that means we need to really know something about the marginal profit curve, and we need to know about the permit allocation, which might be a data setting, a data thing to work through. But on top of that, we need to know what the gains to the regulator are. What are the outcomes the regulator cares about? Then that means that we not only need to think about the permit choice function in relation to profits, we also, to be able to generate these efficiency losses, we also need to map that to labor demand and earnings in this case. Or you could imagine how pollution then affects the communities around the power plants or something else. And I think Iceland is a nice place to think about this. It's one of the oldest and largest tradable permit schemes in fisheries. It's kind of a poster child for this mechanism. It was started in the late 80s. And it's generated in the following way, or works in the following way. The government releases a stock goal, an aggregate heart cap every year. And then each firm has a fraction of that cap that they're permanently allocated. That cap that goes from a fraction into kilograms or tons of fish by this cap that's announced every year. And then those permits are tradable, importantly via brokers. And I mention this because we're going to see some evidence of transaction frictions that we have to control, to take seriously in the model. What's also nice about fisheries in general is that we have data on these daily trips they're taking. They're mostly daily. And the crews are fixed aboard the vessel. So we have this really nice way to map from production to labor demand, because we know how many days it took them to go out to fish, and we know the crew sizes. So we know kind of the person days it takes to harvest. The other thing about this setting here is that actually wages and earnings are a fraction of harvest revenue, which are determined in collective bargaining agreements. And so we actually have this quite literal mapping between harvest revenue and wages. And interestingly, the labor does not get paid out of any kind of permit trading. Yes?
These crews is like the number of people on each boat?
Yes.
Like, crew members can switch between boats?
Yes, we can. And so you have to kind of really think about that. I won't show much evidence of that here, but in the paper, I kind of show that there isn't much switching. And it's again, because overall aggregate labor demand is falling. So these jobs don't exist in other boats. And it seems like most people pick one boat to go on every year. So they're not sort of doing a lot of switching. And they're going out, there's like a reputational cost. Crews kind of like to stay together. Yeah.
It's a silly question, but if wages are a percentage of harvest revenue.
Yeah.
And total harvest is fixed. If you had uniform prices across all boats, you wouldn't have wage inequality, would you?
You could, because of different labor supply, depending on how many days they go out. If boats are identical, then no. Yeah, boats have to be identical, and if prices are the same, then yes, you would have nothing between them. Yes, that's right. All right.
Sorry.
And no other frictions causing this allocation. Yeah, yeah.
So the production function, if you could sort of speak to that, because if it's not linear with, if they buy more permits, then you would expect they would need more employees.
Yes. So
There's no shifting. Do they get? Yeah.
yeah, so it all happens on the day margin, how many days they go out to sea. You can think of this as almost Leontief, that like I have some days I have to go out to get to this production amount that I'm seeking, and then I just need this amount of labor to be able to get to that number of days. And so that's how that you can generate like an easy labor demand measure in fisheries that might be more difficult in something like, gas plants or something where we have to but you do have to take a stance on what that looks like. Absolutely. So again, there's these two built-in trade limits, which I mentioned, a separate small boat permit market and a harvest requirement on half of the allocation. And well, as I mentioned, there's this very detailed data that can link permit choices to profits and worker outcomes. So first, I'm going to go through some of the sort of just reduced form facts that kind of inform how to look at this and this trade-off. Permit trading was introduced in a staggered way. And so I'm going to look at when these small boats actually went into permit trading. And in particular, I'm just going to follow them by this measure of productivity, the average harvest per person day in 2000, in the pre-period before they got put into permit trading in 2001. And then I'm going to compare two things. How much each of these two groups, how much did high productivity boats get allocated in terms of permits, and how much do they end up harvesting? Because that's going to tell us how much trading is actually going on and how much efficiency is changing. And you see a clear evidence. Here, there's actually a small group that was already trading permits, so you already see a small difference. But when the whole group gets put into permit trading, you see a sharp increase in the amount of harvest the high productivity vessels are doing relative to how much they were allocated. And so you do see that trading really did induce quite a substantial, it's about 20% reallocation of the harvest share by the end of the period. And what does this mean? It's almost mechanical. When this group here that can harvest more per person day is harvesting a higher degree of the cap relative to their share of allocation, labor intensity as a whole has to fall. So aggregate person days is just falling generally, and in fact, relative to their allocation share, we see that about on a whole, average labor intensity has fallen by about 18%. It takes about 18% fewer person days per kilogram of harvest. Second, I'm going to just compare then what happened to the workers on these two groups, high productivity and low productivity boats, relative to the group that was always permit trading. And so these is just a simple difference in differences for these two groups. And then what you see, this is in log earnings, is that the income distribution widens over time. So workers, this is in the low productivity boats have about an earnings difference of about 0.2 log points relative to high earning ones. We can talk later on offline about what happened here. This is because of a cap difference that occurred between the small boats. Yes.
Do you think it is right to interpret what is showing as a sort of evidence of this Porter hypothesis? That is this idea that environmental regulation makes it like more difficult to operate in this market and then self-selects the most productive firms?
Yeah, I mean, but that would be the complete aim of a market in general, is to pick who we need to restrict the cap. We're going to restrict per aggregate production. We need to pick winners, and the market is going to be. So in that sense, yes, absolutely. Yeah. Now, what this is also telling you is that this is inducing redistribution from low income to high income workers, and that is a big problem.
Exactly.
Yes, absolutely. Well, now, then on the trade restriction side, I just want to point out that there is plenty of evidence this is causing an efficiency loss. First of all, small boat permits are cheaper. So this says that these caps are meaningfully different, meaning that the cap for the small boats is more generous in most years. It's about a 30% discount in most years. The regulators were not very happy when I pointed out that actually there's not a difference every year, which means that the regulator isn't being overly generous to the small boat in every case. Which is why it's important to be able to see the price data, right? To be able to notice these efficiency changes. And just to be clear, small boats do have lower income workers and they are more labor intensive. So they are sort of targeting a sector that makes sense. And lastly, the harvest requirement does bind. If you look at the harvest relative to the initial allocation, you can see that there's this bunching right above 50%. But another reason I like this histogram is it points out another bunching, which is around 1. And in fact, it's not because lots of people are not trading at all. It's because they're trading very little. And that's just anecdotally because they have a hard time finding buyers or sellers, counterparties, because of these brokers, these search frictions. So that's just something to keep in mind here. Or because their initial allocation works. And so the model is going to help us deduce, sort of separate those two things. And lastly, we see evidence, this is one example of that these constrained boats, the ones that bunch at 50%, are going out on less lucrative days to meet that goal. And so average trip catch, they're just less productive because they have to go out on worse days because they would otherwise have wanted to sell. And so there's the evidence here of that this is really constraining production or distorting production. So, okay, so we see this problem. We see efficiency gains. We see redistribution away from low-income workers. And we see that these two trading restrictions seem to have some efficiency loss in response to trying to affect the trading equilibrium. But we want to compare market equilibria to quantify the cost of redistribution. And so that's why I'm going to turn to a model, which I'll go over pretty quickly. Just to remind you, the motivation is to see equilibrium trades under the designed market and under a counterfactual one without the limits. And we need to map permits to profits, labor demand, and earnings. But we observe the choices of days they go out, the daily revenues from going out, and all kinds of trading behavior, permit quantities traded and prices. We're going to need cost of production in order to take revenue minus costs and create profits. And we're going to need to be able to take some stances to map production to labor outcomes. So in the model, effective boats basically have these profits and an allocation, choose their permit level such that marginal profits are equal to a permit price, which is observed, plus a transaction cost function, which I sort of try to, which is what my way of controlling for the fact that it seems like allocation does matter independently because they can't always find a counterparty to shift how much they're producing. This identifies the mean of daily costs, right? It kind of gives you one level because it tells you something about marginal profits at this one level and this one quantity. And then production is going to happen. They get daily cost shocks for the year and then choose the highest profit days to harvest the quantity goal, the permit level that they have. And so basically, you can think of this almost like a discrete, kind of a fancier discrete choice problem. This is going to create a likelihood of choosing different days based on the cost differences between days. You're likelier to choose a day if the relative costs are different. And so this kind of identifies the slope of the cost curve. It identifies the variance of daily costs across the year. If there's big likelihood differences, costs are going to vary. And so there's no analytical likelihood to understand what days you're going to choose to meet this profit goal. And so I use method of simulated moments where I take guesses of this cost distribution and see what rationalizes the fishing days and permit choices that I observe. And then how do I then that allows me to get at this, which is sort of the ex ante profits you would get for harvesting at a certain level. And then I use the data basically to look at how that maps to earnings and labor demand. I can sort of understand based on the collective bargaining agreements, the function between harvest revenue and the wage bill. And how that distributes to different individuals. And then how labor demand is simple. It's just the crew size that I observe times the expected days to harvest permits, which I know because I can sort of guess what their daily revenue curve through the year looks like, a daily quantity curve. And then that allows me to show what profits would be under no trade and under trade. And you see that in fact, gains from trade are sizable. It's about 12% more value is created just from this permit trading scheme across all the years I observed. And that the controlling for transaction costs really is meaningful. And I think there's more work to do here about why this destroys about a quarter of the gains from trade overall of the market. And then just think about new designs. You can strip away those trading restrictions, find the new permit choice function that's implied, and then search for the new price that clears the market at existing caps. So you're always sort of fixing the caps themselves at the same level. And then you can generate kind of data, empirical versions of those stylized graphs I showed you, which I have always liked. So this is just for 1 year, 2003. I kind of look at about a 15-year period. And so here, this is the permit supply and demand curve in each market in 2003. And I have searched for the equilibrium price that in a unified market that would give the same cap. So this would then clear the market. This is the permit price at the unified market. And what we see is that in this particular year, there are about 7%, there's about foregone profits, about $2 million because of segmentation, or about a 5% decrease in the gains from trade across all years. So kind of small. And that's because on the margin, the days that are getting substituted from large to small boats actually don't have huge profit differences. So even though the averages are really high, the sort of marginal day that's swapping doesn't have huge profit differences, and so the efficiency losses aren't that large. And then there's a harvest requirement. Here again, you can just see what the supply curve would be in a unified market, and then that shifts up under the harvest requirement. We see in this particular year, it's about 16%, and across all the years, the efficiency losses are greater. It's about a 15% decrease in the gains from trade. And then I think the final thing I just want to say is this differences of the roles of the two restrictions kind of comes from a targeting thing. That in fact, segmentation targets much better a labor intensive characteristic, having a small boat, but that's a place where high incomes are actually still pretty high. Meanwhile, the production requirement actually does a better job of targeting vessels that have low incomes under a unified market, a non-restricted market. These are boats that would be high net sellers. And so when you compare, this is the final bottom line, when you compare the cost per dollar to low income labor, the redistributive cost of these two restrictions, you see that in fact, it's about $6. This is high. However, it's kind of lower than some other places where we've studied this, like electricity rate design, which has an implicit redistribution as well. And these are people who have high incomes when they are fishing, but have a low lifetime earning. So you can think of this as like redistributing income to them when they are in the highest earning job that they'll ever have. The second thing is this labor increase. What's the cost of the employment increase? Here you see that there's very big stark differences between the two trading restrictions. And in fact, this one here, when you do both, can kind of end up dominating the production requirement alone. You do more redistribution, so at less cost, and you do having a cheaper employment increase overall. And if you kind of benchmark this against what a job is, you get a number for employment creation that's actually well within the bounds of what governments use to think about their own employment programs, and certainly about considerably less than tariff policies or domestic purchase requirements relative to the amount of employment that they create. And so I think what I'd just like to leave you with is that these trading rules, you can think of them not as some sort of distraction, but that they are policy levers, just like any redistributive instrument of the government, that they have their particular roles, and in fact, mixing them can be advantageous. And as throughout this, you've seen some other things, like the importance of targeting, taking transactions costs seriously, taking the labor market institutions seriously. And in fact, later on, they add this resource tax where the government tries to raise revenue itself and do various kinds of transfers on its own. And just generally speaking, it speaks to this literature on how to deal with the communities that lose out under a sustainability transition, and to understand the role of markets in that transition as a result, which requires really understanding what does the regulator or electorate value and why, and how those kinds of objectives map onto the firm permit choices that allow us to understand the outcomes in the market. So thank you so much for your attention and all your questions. And yeah, I'm very excited to be here. So thanks.
Hello, everyone. I'm Max Garcia, postdoc at Brown, going to the market this fall. I'm very happy to present this paper, part of my research agenda on irrigation institutions, called Governing Environmental Markets, Evidence from Irrigation in Water Markets. This is joint work with Jose Belmar at the IDB. So I will start saying something I hope is not controversial. Property rights institutions matter for markets and development. But I want to note that environmental markets are special because there is cost exclusion, there is rivalry and the usage. And so basically those facts lead us to have a trade of the commons many times present in these goods, such as fisheries, forestry, water. And so enforcement and monitoring, they are intrinsically more complex than for most markets. And usually, enforcement is provided by the state, but the state faces many rigidities and frictions on providing this service, while communities sometimes may have better information, stronger capacity, and incentives. So the question we want to address today is what's the impact of local institutions on the efficiency of these environmental markets? And the setting we will discuss today is water markets, and we will analyze the efficiency of the allocation of water within these water markets. And the context is Chile, which has a very interesting setting. There's a system of private property rights over water, what we call water rights. What is interesting is that they are full property rights. They are tradable, inheritable, separated from the land, perpetual, and protected against expropriation. However, this has imposed restrictions on the government on how to provide enforcement. In this case, we have institutional variation. Some basins have what I call water boards, or in Spanish, Junta de Vigilancia, which are self-governed irrigators organizations with the legal power to provide enforcement in the shape of irrigation shifts. I will discuss this later. And so they have legal power and physical capacity to provide enforcement. To illustrate, these are the Andes. This is the Pacific, water flows from the mountains to the ocean. And we have in the middle valleys with farms located upstream and others located downstream. During normal times, the system restricts the access to water by limiting the size of the infrastructure. There are charts that describe how big your pipes can be. If you own, for example, Karl, 10 liters per second, there's a specific size of the infrastructure you can have to allow you to extract that water. So the system self-reduces during normal times. During droughts, of course, you can adjust the size of the infrastructure dynamically without some kind of automatic system. This is the 80s and 90s in developing countries. So this guy, nobody's stopping this guy from taking all the water and leaving downstream users without water. What this institution does, I will show you today, is first they reallocate water from upstream to downstream, and we will also show the productive consequences of that. So what we do, we estimate the causal impacts of local enforcement and monitoring institutions on the efficiency of water markets, meaning that we look at the productivity, input distribution, output distribution, and production decisions. And the main result is based on an anomalous allocation test where we compare the marginal product of water as a function of where you are located in the basin. And this test relies on the timing of rainfall. And the main result is that markets are inefficient in the absence of this institution. The marginal product of water will increase as you move from upstream to downstream, reflecting the fact that upstream users are taking too much, leaving too little for those downstream. In the presence of the institution, instead, markets are efficient. Or at least we can project that they are efficient. So water markets work well only under the appropriate set of institutions. And we will understand better this result by exploring different families of mechanisms. Redistribution, we want to understand if this is a zero-sum gain or if there are net gains from providing enforcement. And also we will explore the scope of private adaptations towards, associated to the lack of water downstream. We will use two different designs. One, a difference in difference design, exploiting the staggered adoption of these boards. The second will be IV based on the distance to the port where you start the process to create these boards. And the main results are striking. Downstream farms increase 2 standard deviations of their own distribution, their water consumption after the establishment. There is also increase of 60% of standard deviation in their yield. Upstream farms instead, they reduce their water consumption by almost 1 standard deviation of their own distribution, but they don't suffer substantial losses in yield. We also document increases in river stream flow, meaning that indeed the channel here is redistribution through the river, as you can expect. And we also document in terms of private action expectations. There's a longer growing season downstream after you allow them to enjoy water reliably. And also larger farms improve their irrigation technology. They switch from ditches to micro irrigation. So I will not stop long here, but we are the first design-based analysis of impacts of governance in the allocation of privatized commons, and in particular over water in general. We also developed this normal misallocation test, which doesn't rely on observing inframarginal usage of the input. And we document variation, or importantly, we could document variation in the effects of establishing markets depending on what institutions you have. Any questions so far?
Where do the permits enter in this diagram that you showed, right? Because you said that in Chile, there are also the permits, right? That eventually a permit holder, in principle, could do whatever he or she wants with it or not.
Next slide.
Okay, okay.
So this is the roadmap for today. I will start describing the context, then the misallocation test, and finally the mechanisms. Water rights. What they are private rights over surface and groundwater. They are established. So they specify an absolute stream flow that you can take with a monthly schedule in a specific location. So for example, in front of the MIT bridge, Karl can extract 10 liters per second the whole year. And they are complete property rights. They are fully transferable, separate from the land, immutable. And so we don't see many of the frictions we usually find in developing countries when discussing this type of markets. And regarding how we create these permits, there is a process of proclamation. If there is water available in source, you can go to the local office of the National Authority of Water Matters and demand the creation of the right. If they assess, the status of the source allows you, you will get the permit for free. And that process can be done every time until we reach a cap. And then the only way you can get access to water is by purchasing it from other people. The guys behind the system, they were literal students from Coast. And so they really believe once you establish well-defined property rights and then allow trade, you will reach an efficient allocation of the resource. What about droughts? The law prescribes a distribution proportional to ownership. So if there's a drought, Karl, sorry.
No.
There is 50% of water in the river, you just get 5 liters instead of 10. Enforcement. The question of enforcement is natural. As I described, infrastructure limits how much you can take during normal times. But during droughts, well, there is a national authority on water matters, but they have limited capacity and legal scope. And this is not accidental. The main institutional issues you will face on adjusting to the drought will imply quantify the adjustment to the titles, right? Calculating that we need to take just 5 liters instead of 10. We also need enforcement of that. And finally, some monitoring. We need to keep a good picture of what's happening. But by design, the state is out of the picture. The history of expropriation related to land reform and, well, Chicago boys, led to the design of the system where the state cannot provide enforcement. And so in this context, we have this local institution called water boards, which are the self-governing institution that they can establish local taxes. They can provide public goods. They can appoint the judge of waters, but more importantly, they decide and enforce the water allocation during a drought. So what they do is they will quantify how much water there is in the river, and they will calculate that, for example, if Karl owns 10 liters, I owe 5, and they say, okay, they run the numbers, and they find that you need to get access of 8 hours of irrigation, and I will get 4. And what they do is they send the car and will close your gate until it's your shift. And once your shift when your shift arrives, they will send it, they will unlock it, and you will get the full amount of water until you end your shift. And then they move on. And this institution is not unique. You can find it in Ostrom's work. What is unique is the setup where the state provides the legal backup to these actions. And just to give you more clear picture of where we are, this is the north of Chile, this is Patagonia, south of Chile, and this is the central part. The red polygons show the jurisdictions of all of these boards. As you can see, there is no board in the north, very little action in the north, nothing in the south, and this is very natural. The north is the driest part of the world, and so agriculture is not sustainable. Nobody cares about water there because there is not enough or anything. Patagonia instead is one of the wettest parts in the world. There is no water scarcity, and so there is no need. There is no conflict of water. Here instead, you have a Mediterranean climate with a very long dry season. Rain falls in the winter, creating snow cap. The snow cap melts during the spring, giving a very apt environment for the growing of very high value crops, such as grapes, olives. So there is conflict. There is a resource that is valuable but scarce.
Sorry, just on that map, and tell us something about which drove when each one was established where?
Yes. I will explain the tidal option. Sorry, I don't have it specifically in this version, but I think I will revisit the question when I move to the.
So can you remind me how this interacts with trading? So you said there's a cap announced, and then people go and get permits until they reach that cap, and then the only way is to sell it. So there's this like dynamic thing. I mean, people could, in expectation of droughts, just hoard a bunch of permits if they're useful to them in droughts.
And it happened.
And that has happened. Okay.
Has happened, and eventually some reform established a system of fines in case you don't use your rights.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So
Trade,
it's not.
trade exploded after that.
Yeah. Okay.
More questions? So the misallocation test. Formally, there are markets everywhere here. These rights are real estate, so they are tradable as you could trade a home. And so within a basin, which is our measure of a market, you expect the marginal product to be equalized across locations, right? And to test this, we will estimate the marginal product of water as a function of where you are located in the basin. And I will show you briefly the model. So this is a model of agricultural production. And the decisions are taken basically at the beginning of the season. This is for annual crops. At the beginning of the season, you will choose crop, land, capital, and how many water rights you will buy. And then during the season, you will choose labor and irrigation. And the source of uncertainty is rainfall, because rainfall will be a perfect substitute of irrigation. And so basically, this is the production function, and you have this restriction that you cannot irrigate more than what you own in terms of water rights. So this is the key parameter in this model. Each, the first order condition for the farmer will equate the marginal product water to their shallow value, expected shallow value. And so a social planner that we can relocate these water rights will try to equate those shallow values. So the question is, how do we estimate this? If we have random rainfall shocks, we can measure the response profits to that will give us expected shallow value. And the measure of the rainfall we will use is the rainfall falling within the season that your crop needs irrigation. So you at the beginning of the season choose a crop, your neighbor will choose another one. The neighbor will need irrigation until November, I will need until March. Whatever rainfall falls between November and March is useful for me, but not for him. That's a variation combined with spatial variation. My friend in the next county will grow the same crop as me, but he will have some marginal differences in how much rain he will get.
Also, in terms of this upstream, downstream relationship, right? That rainfall to someone that is downstream, rainfall upstream, it's much more important that eventually, right? Does this?
I think we will look at the equation. I hope that will address your concern. But yes, indeed, there is some sorting space, but this doesn't matter here.
Okay.
The data will be the agricultural census in 2007. The sample will be farms with access to irrigation that belong to some canal association and declare owning or renting property rights over water. And the placebo will be private farms. So this is the main equation. We will regress the value of yield per hectare as a function of the triple interaction between useful rainfall, distance to the sea, which is our measure of where you are in the basin, and the presence of boards, controlling for county fixed effects, crop fixed effects, and farm level controls, including location of the manager, capital decisions, technology decisions. The marginal product of water will be reflected by these parameters. And the main test will be related to beta 6 and beta 7, because they show the slope of the marginal product as a function of distance to the sea. This is the main result. In blue, you see the shallow value for areas with boards. So you can see it's flat around 0, constant. Definitely we cannot reject this, they are different. For the red one is for areas without these boards. And as you can see, it's increasing. Upstream areas have a very low value. Downstream areas have a very high value. Again, the intuition here, and we will show later, is that these guys are taking too much compared to the socially efficient allocation. This is a placebo for rainfall farms. As you can see, there are no differences. So we have two main challenges. Measurement is the first. If nobody's in charge of enforcing anything, nobody cares about measuring. So we turn to satellite imagery. We use a novel USGS product that estimates evapotranspiration since 1985, combined with Landsat 5 measures of agricultural production with a resolution of 30 meters, which allowed us to measure this at the plot level. We will combine this with the land plot limits information from the Timecodes Authority, and we will use farms located within a kilometer of a canal in the country. The second challenge, of course, is Additionality. And you were pointed out, the timing and the location is not random. So in the short term, we will run an event study diff and diff, exploiting staggered option only on the sample of please eventually adopt these boards. Did it do something?
Don't worry.
And the second approach will rely on NIV that we'll describe in a second, but basically there are two main ways you can establish these boards. One is an agreement, the second is a lawsuit. If you own rights and you feel like somebody's taking your water, you can demand from the state the creation of these boards. And that lawsuit, the competent court, is located in the most upstream province capital city in the basin. We will show that this is a reasonable instrument for this question and will allow us to explore the long-run impacts of this. So to illustrate the resolution of our data, each dot here is a plot. This is upstream, this is downstream areas. As you can see, there is more water consumption upstream than downstream. This is one of the largest agricultural basins in the country, and we have this data for 80,000 farms. So the main equation will relate water consumption and yield to the relative time to the board establishment event, controlling for flexible time trends with local resolution, plot fixed flex. We will use a imputation estimator for the variable space, and this is the main result. After the establishment of these boards, downstream farms increase their water consumption, reaching 2 standard deviations after 7 years. Upstream farms instead, they reduce their water consumption after 7 years, as you can see here. Mid-section areas, you can see nothing happens. Yield instead, you see this increase downstream and no systematic reduction upstream. To look for long-run impacts, then we use the instrument, which is the square of the distance to the most upstream province capital city in the basin, controlling for, I will show you later the specification, but challenges are natural. This is a geographic-based instrument, and so we could have some correlation with other characteristics. We show that the instrument is not correlated with market access or climate variables. We will separate the analysis for segment of the river to preserve SUPA. And this is the main equation. Yeah.
Just out of interest, how is it not correlated with market access? What's driving that spatially?
So the market access measure we have is the access to the ports for exports and Santiago, the main domestic port. We measure the distance through the road network.
So you're doing international market access, you're not doing the full GE market access.
The national market also is centered around Santiago. Many times producers sell to Santiago and then resell to other cities. But yeah, explicit measure of market access, we're working on that. So this is the main regression. We'll measure evapotranspiration in the summer, yield, growing season length, and access type of irrigation. As a function of presence overboard, we will distribute the presence overboard with this distance to the port. And you can see that downstream, you have an increase of 2 millimeters. Transition is not natural, but this is a more than 6% increase compared to similar areas. A reduction of 1 millimeter. We have, we also use the Anderson-Rubin test to address potential weak instrument issues. If we look at yields, we see this large increase downstream, but no reduction upstream. The downstream areas grow their crops for 1 month longer period without boards downstream. Yeah, only large, sorry, come. Don't do it now.
9 minutes.
9 minutes. Only large farms switch to more efficient irrigation. This is a context where there are definitely great constraints for smaller farms. If we look at traditional irrigation, we see 20 percentage points less use of furrow for large farms and a 20 percentage point increase in micro irrigation. If we convert the definitive estimates to the IV, they are mostly consistent. And how could downstream gains can be larger than upstream losses? Apart from the private investments, downstream increases happen also in the extensive margin. We don't find evidence of reductions in the extensive margin upstream. So basically, we are allowing some farms to get any access to irrigation, while upstream, we're just taking water from the margin, some of them. Finally, we have this definitive analysis of stream flow. Why? Because these canals are extracting water from the river. And so if any redistribution at the large scale we document is happening, it should happen through the river. And this is the main result. We don't find anything when we look at at the winter stream flows. When we look at summer stream flows, we see these increases around 24% for upstream farms in basins with high share of cropland. We don't find anything in downstream farms with low cropland share. We find intermediate effects for the other parts of the matrix. Consider with the idea that this increase in the stream flow is happening during summer when water is scarce, when everybody's running to the water to get water. And in areas where water is more, conflict is more prevalent because everybody needs more water, as opposed to areas with low cropland share. These patterns are consistent with the data on canal and crop irrigation calendar. And yeah, regarding the timing, areas that establish mostly these areas with boards are more productive historically. Areas that adopted boards earlier usually were drier than areas after. So that's a challenge that we I'm very happy to discuss later if you have some ideas about how to take from that. The conclusion. Water boards improve efficiency by physically enforcing property rights. And so the another question is why there's any inefficiency if we have well-defined property rights? And the answer is that they are not well-defined because they need enforcement. And so property rights need enforcement and illegal adaptations are not enough to solve institutional issues, at least at this scale. And there is a market design tension, too much or too little power to governments versus users. This situation emerges because the government cannot provide enforcement, because the government has their hands tied by the Constitution. Most research and development usually focuses on too much regulation imposing market frictions. And here we are documenting the opposite. Too little regulation may also imply market friction. And finally, enforcement and monitoring institutions are key to address open access. And we think this applies to other markets, although the incentives may be less clear in the case of a fishery, for example. It's not obvious who is losing when we don't have enforcement. Here, the analysis, the directionality of water helps us to identify losses due to that. And finally, I'm very happy to chat later about what happens when climate change starts affecting these areas. These boards and this area of study have been suffering drought since 2010. And in a separate paper, I'm studying what is happening to these areas. In short, these boards, which had control over groundwater since 2005, have been saving water, imposing short-run costs. But this is it. Thank you very much.
Questions, if anyone's got, yeah.
Do you have a sense of what's the GDP or financial gains of this better reallocation and comparing that to the costs of operating this board?
Thank you. So I'm working on quantifying the gains from this. If I work with the schedule values, water taken from here, I'm getting, my very preliminary numbers are 70% increase in yield per hectare for the tail of the river. The 20%, the last quintile of the river gains 76% of yield which gives us, in average, something like 17% of the production of that year. Regarding the costs, I don't have a good number for that. I know the cost of operation of them are very low. One medium-sized farm is something like one minimum wage over the whole year as a membership fee that covers everything. And the teams itself are very small. Like you have a board with 5 members, you have a CEO, a lawyer, an hydrologist, and 10 guards for serving something like 5,000 farmers. It seems to me the cost is mostly on establishing and process of establishment. This lawsuit I described could take 3 years, 2 years. More recently, 2015, it took 2 years at least. So it's more like a very costly process. And I do have, I don't remember what it is, but if you plot farm size, areas with boards have a U-shaped curve, while areas without boards have an inverted U-shape, meaning that you need these large farms downstream with the legal, with the capital, to keep sustaining a lawsuit over 3 years. Yeah, so I don't have a good answer for the second. Thank you.
Oh, I just had I kind of briefly sort of following up on this. I mean, you could also think about it as what kinds of misallocate, like you say, you can sort of reject, or you can't reject that it's inefficient, but but you really, another way to phrase it is you can reject a certain amount of misallocation and not. And that tells you something, because then you point to sort of sources of misallocation that could still exist. There's these capital market frictions and so on. And so we imagine maybe the water market's not working perfectly. Yeah.
An IO person will tell you that there are many frictions here, including there are frictions on when you trade, you need to destroy your infrastructure and adjust it to the new water level and you have. That friction's being studied by some people. I would say this is, the literature in misallocation is focusing on understanding second order variation. This is a first order misallocation, if you want to put it that way. So yeah, thank you.
Okay, cool. We have a break for 15 minutes. Let's thank our speaker.
It's just that you want to audio the representation. Things that it is super kids at home also sick, so you can.
Yeah, poor thing.
But then she heard me and just dropped me a message saying, hey, I see you managed to come to London. I guess she heard something, because she just wrote. This is my colleague, because she just wrote this, so I guess at least this first session, it makes sense, it's very IO, right, this first session. I would be interested eventually in the next break. Tell me a little bit of what your project about. Say it's like addressing externalities for growth or something like that, Well, at this stage, I appreciate but already have a lot of fun.
Okay, hello everybody, welcome back to day 2 of Environment Week. If you just arrived, a reminder that our speakers have 30 minutes each, questions throughout. I'll be sat over here letting you know. I'll be over here and I'll let you know which one next.
Okay.
Okay,
sounds
all
good.
right, thank you everyone.
All right, so thank you to the organizers for including our paper in the program. This is joint work with Lorenzo, who used to be here, he's now in Madrid, and my colleague Charlie in the Department of Geography and Environment. So this paper is going to think about whether we can use tree planting as a policy to impact poverty. Okay, so the main motivation for this, like the high level view, is just the US SDGs, UN SDGs are emphasizing that ecosystem services and biodiversity conservation are essential to human well-being, and they're trying to create an agenda where these two can sit alongside each other. At the same time, there's like a global enthusiasm around tree planting as a means of climate change mitigation and adaptation, and essentially all pathways to mitigating or keeping global warming below 2 or 1.5 degrees Celsius entail some form of tree planting. Okay. Within this, though, there's several questions that have been raised about what are the optimal project designs for tree planting schemes, and whether there's some ancillary economic or ecological benefits that could be had. So nature-based solutions, in this case, large-scale tree planting, could jointly address poverty and environmental concerns. Okay, so climate mitigation just through sequestering carbon. Climate adaptation, so there's been some evidence. So there's evidence that it can prevent landslides by solidifying soil on hillsides. Less evidence on floods. It could go either way. It could actually increase floods or reduce floods. But really what we're going to be concerned about in this paper is poverty reduction, right? So creating through job creation, and the other one is through transferring the assets to communities. All right, so the program we're going to look at is in the Philippines. This is the National Greening Program, or the NGP. This is a national scale program that planted over 2 million hectares of land, over 1.7 billion trees, and directly employed over 700,000 people. This is primarily a reforestation program, but there were further scopes in terms of poverty reduction, food security, and ecosystem services. All right. So the DNR, this is the Department of Environment and Natural Resources. They're going to invest in what are called people organizations. These are, you can think of these as like local organizations or cooperatives. All right. They are going to receive regular payments for 3 years to undertake various activities. So this would include seedling production, preparing the sites, and then maintaining those plantation sites. And along this way, they're being monitored by the DNR and like various extension services. After the 3 years that they establish the plantation, the forestry assets are then transferred to the PO, and they can manage it how they want. And all profits return back to the PO. Okay? So in short, communities are being paid to grow a natural asset. And then reductions in poverty can come through 2 channels. essentially, just a second. Through the payment, right, those 3 years of payments that they're getting to maintain. And then through the forestry asset.
How should we think about what it's being replanted from, in the sense that one might also think that there's an opportunity cost of what they are not doing with the land if they were previously using it for catch crops?
So most of this is happening on degraded land.
Okay.
In short, okay? All right, so the question, we're gonna ask several questions to this, but the main question is just, did the NGP reduce poverty? All right, along this is, when did the poverty start reducing and how long was this sustained in time? We're gonna also think about spillover effects, so whether this had spillover effects into surrounding villages. And then we want to think about kind of sectoral changes. So how did the program reduce poverty? But whether it allowed people to change different sectors, whether it allowed people to accumulate different assets and change wages, and then whether people were migrating, okay? So it's gonna start thinking about structural transformation, localized structural transformation. And then where we're gonna try to ultimately end up in this paper is, why did this NGP reduce poverty, right? So trying to separate out what is the value added of the forestry asset on top of this kind of payment for work scheme. All right, so what we're gonna do in this paper is we're going to exploit the phase and design of the NGP, and we're gonna compare treated municipalities and villages. We're gonna operate at 2 levels, municipality and village. So we're gonna compare municipalities that have not yet been treated to control, as well as, so either you have not yet been treated or you've never been treated, okay? So some of the main findings that we find, so we see a 6 percentage point reduction in poverty. We use this alternative measure of the share of unlit settlements. We also see reductions in this. Through our event studies, we show that the effects are immediate. So the payment is causing an immediate reduction in poverty. And these are sustained after the payment period, as well as it increases after the payment period, okay, in the long run. In terms of employment, we see that there's reductions in people working in agriculture, and these people are moving into unskilled manual labor and services. In terms of labor changes, we do not see any effect of like migration. And then lastly, we see that agricultural income is reducing, non-ag income is increasing, and we see that people are increasing the assets that they're purchasing. All right, so some contributions that we make in this. So there's generally an inherent trade-off between environmental quality and poverty alleviation, and policies that are trying to maximize both of these rarely occur. The second part we're going to try to think about is multifaceted interventions that are granting productive assets alongside cash transfers. So large transfers, which create better jobs for the poor, are an effective means of getting people out of poverty traps and reducing global poverty. Okay, so that's where we're ultimately trying to end up here. And then lastly, we're going to think about structural transformation and conservation programs. So there's been less work on this. So the NGP was able to reduce employment or led to reductions in the agriculture sector and increased unskilled manual labor and services. All right, so the context of this, so the Philippines is basically experiencing, yes.
Maybe that was Claire's question, but you're not going to look at deforestation. So you're not expecting the decrease in agricultural employment to translate into any decrease in deforestation of.
So in this paper, we're not, yeah.
But you're not expecting this given the context, just to clarify.
So we do other checks and we see that forest cover is increasing in the areas that this program was happening as a check. So it's not.
But because of the trees that are planted, are meant to be other trees.
So we don't, like in this paper, we're not going to think about displacement of deforestation or whether deforestation is happening. Yeah, okay. So the Philippines has experienced deforestation for the last 100 years, okay? And then in the last 2 decades, they've lost about 1.42 million hectares. This is like a 7.6% decrease in forest cover, all right? So the NGP was launched in 2011. by the Aquino administration. And this was essentially to halt deforestation, and their plan was to basically plant billions of trees across the entire Philippines. The budget was $710 million, and they were planting 1.7 billion trees from 2011 to 2018. And this program is still going on today, okay? So tree planting is mostly happening on degraded lands. There's also mangrove plantations that are happening, and then they'll also do some in protected areas. All right, so what is the role of the DNR in this? So they're overseeing nursery establishment. They're identifying where plantations should be planted, and then they're providing technical support and program monitoring of the POs. All right, so this is through their extension services. It works at different levels. So there's the DNR on top, and then there's PENROs and CENROs. So PENROs would be provincial level, and then CENROs are working with a collection of municipalities. So the DNR is going to form these partnerships with these POs, and the POs are receiving a fixed per hectare payment for producing seedlings, preparing the sites, planting the sites, and then maintaining and implementing protective measures for 3 years. After these 3 years, the assets are then transferred to the PO, and then all profits are going back to that PO and the members of the PO. Okay. And then lastly, there was the goal was to have an 85% survival rate, and they claim that there was an 83% survival rate of their plantations. Okay.
Sorry, just the payments, or they are also trees for productive?
Excuse me?
There are production profits, or this is just profits from the payment?
No, this would be profits. So I'm going to get into like what they planted, but they're going to be planting like coffee, cacao, fruit trees, timber production. So all this stuff can come back to the PO.
Okay.
All right, so yeah.
Did the PO receive flexibility to plant any trees that they wanted and produce seedlings?
Yeah, so there's like kind of like an approved list per site, essentially, that they could then choose what they wanted to plant. All right, so the data we have, so we have over 80,000 individual tree planting projects. We know when the municipality or village received this plantation. And then we also know how much was planted, the type of plantation, species that was planted, and then we have the shapefile of each plantation, okay? So this is data on the area of each of these plantations, and most of these are small scale, so like the average is like 16 hectares, okay? We then identify like kind of broad categories of where these fit in. So the majority are either agroforestry, these would be like coffee and cacao or fruits. And then there's a lot of reforestation. So this could be like bamboo, rattan, timber production. And then there's some like mixed sites. And then there's some urban sites, which we don't really do much with. All right, so this is showing data. It's the same, kind of the same data. One is just spatial and this is also temporal, okay? So what we're exploiting here is the phase and design of when this program arrived to municipalities or villages, okay? So here we see in 2011 that 50% of municipalities are treated in the first year of its program, and 20% never received this program in our time frame, okay? We're also going to look at the village level because we can take advantage of higher spatial dimension here. So here we have around 6% are treated within the first year, villages, okay? And 78% of villages never receive this program. All right, empirical strategies. So we're going to leverage the staggered rollout to this program through Calorie Santana specification. We have two outcomes for this. The first is going to be small area poverty estimates. This is like the main way the Philippines government measures poverty throughout the country. Okay, so this would be like the percentage of people that fall below the poverty line. And then we're going to create this measure of unlit settlements. Okay, so this is going to combine nighttime lights with the global human settlement data. So building footprint, okay? And then we aggregate these in different ways. So we're going to basically just show standard event study type plots here. All right, so then at the village level, we're doing the same thing, same setup as the municipality level, okay? But then we want to also estimate spatial spillovers. So these could be happening through two ways. One is just that we could expect this kind of infusion of cash and plantations coming in, could affect neighboring villages through common food or labor markets. And then also in the Philippines, you know, villages are interconnected through kind of complex economic, socioeconomic networks. There's kinship ties, trade relationships, and communal governance structures. So this is what we're kind of expecting, that there might be some spatial spillover. And how we're going to do this is we're going to limit the sample to only control villages, all right? So in this kind of like fake map here, we have green as the actual treated ones, but we're going to focus exclusively on the blue villages, all right? And we're going to use the same phase and design as before, but it's whether your neighbor is treated in that 2011 cohort. So these are control villages that never received this program, but their neighbor received it in 2011. So we're going to assume that they're kind of like treated in that time period. Okay, and we're going to follow the same phase in. All right, so main result, yeah.
Sorry, what governed one village being treated and not its neighbor? Is it like the amount of deforestation that there was at baseline?
No, so I mean, so the DNR is basically working with POs. You have to have a PO, and then there's different kind of essentially like how they went through was there's different policies as to like whether you had tenure instruments or not. So there was other criteria as to why you received this program or not. Okay.
And you think this other criteria don't interact with your
Well,
main treatment effect?
yeah, we'll do robustness checks on tenure instruments, and it doesn't affect us. Yeah.
Can you also just speak a little bit whether the program changed market access or closed roads or things like this?
So we haven't looked at that yet, but we can do this. Yeah.
So in case a village is neighboring and with multiple villages with different time of the introduction of the treatment, do you weight that? So in some cases, like a village could be neighboring with different villages who are different in terms of their introduction of the treatment. So do you like kind of weight that introduction period?
No, we don't wait. No, I mean, so these are still going to be compared to a control village that has no neighbor ever treated by this program. So in isolation. Okay. So this is like the main results of our paper, and kind of the paper revolves around the next two slides here. Okay. So on the y-axis, we have small area poverty estimates. And on the x-axis, we have years since you received this reforestation program. And we can see prior to this program, poverty in treated and control areas is not statistically different. But then we see once you receive this program, there's an immediate reduction in poverty, okay? And then the dynamics of this, we see that it levels off, okay? And then there's further reductions in the long run, okay? So we know that in the first 3 years of the plantation site, they're only receiving payments and the sites are not productive, okay? After 4 years, we know that tree plantations start to become productive, depending on the type, right? And so what we're gonna try to do later on is, we know that these 3 years is the payment is reducing poverty, but then we want to try to disentangle what part is that plantation and what part is the payment. Like the residual payment still affecting poverty. Okay. So that's a 6 percentage point reduction on average of poverty. If we look at on the settlements, we see that there's a slight delay, and then there's an immediate reduction, and there's still a continued decrease in the long run. All right. At the village level, again, similar story. So we see a 10 to 11 percentage point reduction in unlit settlements. And then if we look at spillover effects, we see also that there is some spillover into neighboring villages. Yeah.
So sorry if I missed this. How big are the payments? Like household income share or something?
The payment, so that I don't have off the top of my head, but it's like per hectare, and there's like different payments along the different things that you have to do to maintain the plantation. So seedling production will have a certain payment, doing productive measures will have a different one.
So then can you do like the back of the envelope of, how much gap there is from the poverty rate? Like, is that even in year one, is this from a multiplier from demand, or is this like the payments alone could actually be closing that? This seems like a huge effect. Right?
Yeah, okay.
It-
Yeah,
It also seems like a huge effect, given that it would be useful to know, I guess, what percentage of the population or of the area of these villages do you expect are affected? I don't know, because you're doing it at the village or municipality level, but you have the exact polygons.
yeah,
Can you give us a sense of how?
like the share of treated
Yeah,
land.
exactly. Did you
Yeah,
also
we
do
could
it as
this
a
as well.
continuous measure or?
Yeah, we don't have this at the moment in the paper.
Okay, yeah, that's okay.
Okay. All right, so robustness checks, we do other estimators, we look at nighttime lights, we look at the share of population that lives in unlit areas. We look at different land tenure arrangements. We also think about Typhoon Haiyan that hit in 2013 and basically, so this is a category 5 typhoon. We also think about insurgency violence in Mindanao in the south. As well as a cash transfer program that was being phased in prior to the program. Okay, and all of our results are robust to any of these checks. All right, so we've seen that this program, when municipality or village receives this program, there's a reduction in poverty. And now we want to think about how did the NGP reduce poverty? So we'll think about labor reallocation, household asset accumulation and changes, and income and wages. All right, so sectoral reallocation, so an increase in labor productivity could be achieved through kind of two channels. One would be through existing economic activities, capital accumulation or technological changes. And then the other one would be labor moving from low productivity to high productivity sectors. All right, so here we're gonna use this kind of 2-period model, and we'll have different sectors that people are working in. Okay, so this is just before and after whether you received this program or not. All right, so here what we see is in areas that receive the NGP, there's an increase in services and unskilled labor. All right, and then we also see a reduction in agriculture or people working in agriculture of around 3.7%. Yeah.
What sector would the program itself fall in if they're taking care of the seedlings?
So there would be two. It'd be like an unskilled, right? So here I just put the different types of contracts or that they would be under, and then skilled as well, because that's where kind of the extension services would fall into. All right. So there's people moving in and out of sectors, so moving out of low productivity to higher productivity sectors. Next, we want to think about labor supply changes. Okay. So whether the increased economic activity is just a result of population growth or shifting people around. Okay, so here we're going to use satellite data that's capturing people throughout the course of the day and night. And here we see really no evidence that people are being shifted around. Yeah.
I don't know how to frame this question exactly, but it seems like you do you see these effects even after the payments, the sectoral reallocation, even after this 3 years of payments, or are these just
so in this one
the years that you see here?
So we only have one pre-period and one post-period, right?
Census data.
And there's something we could do is looking at just kind of the early treated cohorts, like the 2011 cohort, and see what happens with them in the later period.
Right, because I guess what I'm thinking is what would be the market failure that this is addressing? Is it that people didn't want to that trees are costly investments, so there's kind of a poverty trap because of people would be better off. You see what I mean? They're sort of being forced to plant or incentivized to plant something that they weren't planting before. Why weren't they doing that? Is it like a poverty trap because the trees are costly investment? What's the thing that you have in mind?
Okay, so let me come back to that at the end because maybe we get to the story.
Right.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
On this point, I guess I was wondering if you could say something. So this program seems targeted toward economically productive assets, timber that's going to be used or crops. a lot of the reforestation efforts are sort of this economics of doing nothing, that, you're hoping to just plant the trees and leave them there mostly. So, so it strikes me that, broadly speaking, you wouldn't see a lot of these reallocation efforts in those kinds of, unless you have these economically productive crops and trees, right? Would you say, like, I guess I'm sort of, what can we learn about the payments for ecosystem services writ large?
I wondered, I had a similar question, but I wondered if it might be informative to look, I think your earlier bar chart there had an approximately equal share between agroforestry and reforestation or something. There is presumably this kind of environmental benefits trade-off between those things, but here if you split this by those, do you see that the effects all coming from the agroforestry?
So we could, but this is really hard because we are only dealing with like 370 treated municipalities in this one, right? So we can try this, is splitting the two that only had reforestation and only had agroforestry.
For the
Right.
village level.
But at the village level, but the municipality is really hard because basically every municipality has at least one of these or both of these planted at the same time. So we can't separate both of them out.
Previous version.
Yeah. Okay.
So can you use like satellite data to like, if they have like different NDVI, like if like.
So
how-
let me come back to that because I have 5 minutes left and.
Sorry,
Yeah. All right, so we also think about household energy use and durable assets. So this is coming from work in India of NREGs, where these income gains were largely allocated towards consumption or asset acquisition. And then also this cash transfer by Egger and others that show that these were being mostly going towards non-productive assets within the household. All right, so here we see that in areas that receive this program, they're increasing their electricity or connecting into the grid. They're buying televisions and they're also buying refrigerators. All right. And then on agricultural wages, I'm gonna just go through this quickly to get to the part that I would like to in this. We see that agricultural income is decreasing, so there's around a 9% decrease over the control mean, and non-ag income is increasing, and that's around a 20% increase over the control. And then also non-food expenditures is also increasing. Okay, so here's where we're at in the paper at the moment is like, why did this reduce poverty? And we want to think about the financial payment that's going to communities and the forestry asset. So this is coming from previous literature on multifaceted interventions. Overall, the evidence suggests that complementary components to cash transfers can amplify outcomes and deliver greater benefits. Okay, and in this recent paper, so an important next step is kind of understanding which of these components is necessary for generating these benefits. So we're asking, what is driving the continued decreases in poverty in the long run? All right, so this is what we're trying to figure out at the moment is, what is the added impact of poverty that's coming from the forestry asset? And at what point, if any, do these assets begin to drive poverty reductions? Okay, so we know that in the 3 years, the first 3 years, that reductions in poverty are coming from the payment, but then after those 3 years, there's the payment, this like residual effect from the payments that could be driving poverty reductions, as well as the forestry asset. So it's kind of that asset plus payment in that period that we're trying to separate out. Okay, our idea here is to create a measure of plantation productivity using NDVI, and then separating out villages that are either highly productive or lower productive. Okay, and then we'll be able to see that in the low productivity areas, the effect on poverty should really only be coming from that payment. All right, and then the ones in the high productivity would be coming from the asset plus that payment. And the difference between those two would be the effect of the plantation asset. Okay, if you have any thoughts on that, we would love to hear. Like if you have any other ideas of how we could kind of separate out this kind of payment and asset. Can I just finish and then we, okay. So there's a lot of valid concerns around tree planting. Okay, so the scale of land that's required is immense. The timing of this and the permanence of these plantations, and kind of the potential ecological impacts that these programs can have. So it may result in the loss of cropland or consequently compromise food security. Permanence of tree planting, so these could just be cut down later on, or disease could affect these plantations. And then there's also a problem of like kind of monoculture, so creating plantations that are the same, and this can have poor effects on biodiversity. And so in another paper that we're writing is looking at all of this. So we're looking at permanence, we're looking at displacement effects that these plantations might have on land use. Okay, and then lastly, I just want to talk about kind of some policy implications from this program, and kind of the design elements that were crucial for its success. So the main point is really kind of this engagement between extension services of the DNR and the POs. And second would be kind of these long-term incentives to these local organizations. So they're being paid for work, okay? And then they're being given control of that asset in the long run. All right, and then lastly, kind of what we see in these tree planting programs is there's high failure rates. And then here we see like the program claims to have a high survival rate. And this is through kind of this continuous monitoring and support of both the POs and extension officers. Okay, so I'm going to end here and I'll take any final questions that you may have.
Great.
So hi everyone. Yeah, thanks to the organizer for having me. It's an excellent opportunity to present this paper, which is kind of like we're working on it. So I'm grateful for any suggestions. So this is ex post evaluation of forest conservation. It's co-authored with my colleagues in Bamford and Billy Inkin. We all used to be at Exeter and going different places now. So the world has lost about 1/3 of its forests due to agricultural expansion. It's mostly tropical forests, and that's a problem for several reasons. So curbing deforestation could avoid about 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And tropical forests are biodiversity hotspots, so we're also concerned about losing biodiversity. So to protect forests, the foremost policy tool used are protected areas. There's a very wide range of effectiveness, from like negative effects to no effects to positive effects. And a lot of these studies which find limited effectiveness contribute this to location bias. So it means that protected areas are essentially placed in areas that were never under threat. So the protected area impact depends on a couple of things. So it depends on the deforestation risk at the beginning. So this is what some people call potential for additionality. So how much could we actually gain if it was like perfect implementation? Then it depends on the implementation itself. So here we're thinking about enforcement and monitoring. So if you think about initial potential of a site, like how much of that can actually be realized. And then another idea is about policy objectives. So lots of these programs are evaluated just against forest cover, but Philip Delacroix introduced this idea that maybe there is like a trade-off or co-benefits between, what we heard, like environment and development concerns. Maybe sites are targeted for biodiversity or carbon. So our research questions here are: do protected areas reduce deforestation compared to the business as usual scenarios, trying to get really good counterfactuals? How does this outcome vary on the spectrum of deforestation risk or potential for additionality? And is location bias, or we call location bias, basically a reflection of multi-objective policies? So our study is conducted in Bolivia. Bolivia has seen the highest rates in deforestation in South America over the past few years. Bolivia also had a quite late rollout of conservation and the late expansion of the agricultural frontier compared to, example, Brazil. And so on the map, we see the forest cover in 1990 and the protected areas, and then in 2023. So a lot of rollouts happened throughout this period where we got high resolution land cover data. So we're looking at protected areas established between 1991 and 2023. We used the first 5 years to train our models, so that's why these are excluded. So we look at different outcome variables. We look at forest cover, then we have proxies for economic productivity, night lights and grid GDP. We look at biodiversity and carbon. And the unit of analysis, we create hexagons of about 36 square kilometers. There's about 30,000 hexagons in Bolivia. And in terms of identification, we have a machine learning model that is predicting pre-treatment deforestation risk. And then we match these units based on these pre-treatment deforestation risk and implement staggered diff in diff design. So regarding the literature, there's a massive literature on conservation policy. There's reviews by now. Then we're also adding to additionality. Some of these things are overlapping. So there's some consensus that location bias for protected areas and adverse selection for payments for ecosystem services constrain additionality. Then we got the papers by Thales West and colleagues who kind of really questioned the counterfactuals for carbon credits that are traded. And there's also this idea of we might not want to target the highest risk places because it might be in the end more effective to target places that face medium deforestation risk, because you can actually with implementation get these actually working as compared to the high risk places which might just not be feasible to actually get the benefit out of them. And then another paper, that's in environmental development economics by Philip Delicott and colleagues, which introduces this kind of theoretical idea that there are maybe multiple objectives that are kind of to be realized. It also, we're not the first to try to match on predicted risk. There's a paper by Hannes Müller and Christopher Rao who use predicted conflict risk to evaluate power sharing contracts. And there's another paper by Cody Warner and colleagues at Berkeley who use wildfire risk to evaluate PG&E intervention programs, and I'm sure there's many more. So so the contribution, so we're using these, we're matching based on predicted deforestation risk rather than proxies for risks. And we have this model machine learning approach which models duration. I'm gonna talk about this later. And then we can quantify the impacts on kind of a spectrum of initial deforestation risk. And so we're also evaluating these multiple socio-environmental outcomes. So for the outcome variables, we have map biomass data from 1985 to 2023 at 30-meter resolution. Then for economic activity,
Sorry, because you emphasize so much the multi-objectives in terms of policy, what were the objectives of this protected area policy in Bolivia? Was it only environment or also?
There's mixed, I think. We're doing an overall analysis at the moment, and I think it's quite hard to, we can kind of try to categorize them by different definitions. But first, we're gonna look overall and compare whether there's different outcomes. But usually, like some of them have different targets, so we're gonna.
It's very decentralized.
Yeah, we're gonna plan to do analysis on different levels and purposes. So, and then for economic activity, yeah, we use nighttime light data and the gridded GDP product. For biodiversity, we use a data set by a team in Cambridge. It's called Land Cover Change Impacts on Future Extinctions. So that's a life metric, where it basically tells us the change in extinction risk upon a change in land cover. For example, like if we were to restore an area, what would be the decrease in extinction risk? And then we have above ground forest biomass for carbon. So for the random survival forest machine learning algorithm, it's a non-parametric machine learning approach designed for survival analysis. So it comes from the medical literature, and we're applying this to forest dynamics. It's trained on a random sample of pixels from 1985 to 2023, and we censor pixels as soon as a protected area is established, because we don't want the model to get any information from the time that anything is protected. So the other features of this model are we have to feed in time to event and whether an event occurs. That's the indicator variables. So in the medical literature, it works as follows. So if you observe a patient for, let's say, 10 years and they survive the 10 years, the time to event is 10, and then the event indicator is 0 because the event of death didn't occur. So you can kind of handle these rate-sensitive events, which means the events you don't observe because the study period finishes. And so if a person with disease and you observe them for 5 years, time to event would be 5, and then event would be 1. So that's kind of what we apply to forests, and it's a bit less morbid. So with forest modeling, we can do repeatable events or reversible events. So if a forest pixel regrows or forest regrows of this unit, it kind of the timer starts again. So we can handle that, which previously has been more tricky. In terms of yeah.
Do you consider the features of my neighboring pixels? Because I think I'm right in saying that with deforestation, you know, it's the edges of the forest that are most exposed. And if that's the case, then I'm guessing that your study doesn't account for the fact that, you know, risk could change over time in an area. So if I'm in the middle of a protected area, if that area weren't protected, and I might eventually become the edge and therefore have high risk. So do you think about those things, and does that mean your estimates are maybe a lower bound of the impact of the protected areas?
Yeah, we do think about that. So what we do is we kind of, for the risk predictions, we include the surrounding areas of a pixel. So we have the forest cover density of that pixel, or like the distance to land covers. And we have the predictions for every single year. So these are time moving as well. So we think we somewhat accounting for that. Yeah, the feature layers, or like that covariates, whatever you call it, that we're using to train the model to predict deforestation or land cover trends. So we're using the history of the past 5 years of a pixel. We're using how dense is the forest in its different radii from the pixel. We use proximity to different land cover types. We have topography, altitude or aspect slope, elevation, and climate variables. And so what we get is the prediction of these annual deforestation risks. So in this map, you see the 20-year deforestation probability in 1990. This is overlaid with all protected areas that are occurring over the period. So it's kind of like, yeah, the risk here is not moving, but the protected areas are of the end of the study period. What you can see is that a lot of protected areas are generally located in places with low deforestation probability, so in the darker places.
Is density there? That's just what are you capturing in terms of socioeconomics? I'm thinking in particular of roads or market access. Is that incorporated in there?
In this, because we don't want to have any information post protected area establishment, we don't have any roads because I don't think there's time varying data products from early on. So we don't include roads. What we include is distance to agriculture, frontiers, distance to urban areas, but not specifically roads. Different distance to water bodies, which could be transport means as well, but not directly roads. Yeah. And so this is also, we kind of find what other papers have found before. So this is location bias. So we find that the lighter curve is where protected areas are established with like, mainly with very low long-term deforestation probability. And then in the green distribution where no protected areas are observed, the distribution is much wider. So what we do is we match units based on the deforestation risk in the year prior to establishment. So if a protected area was established in 2000, we would look at the deforestation risk in 1999 and would find a matching site that had a similar deforestation risk in 1999. Yeah.
Does the establishment of a PA change the risk of deforestation of other areas due to displacement of logging activities, etc.?
Yeah, we definitely assume it would. So that's why we're kind of matching on the pre-treatment staff deforestation risk, because that's exactly what we expect that this might change. So we have matching variables. So with the survival probability, we get different time horizons. So we match over different time horizons from like 5 to 30 years. Yeah, Martin.
Yes, you said that one of the reasons why you don't take this road network into account is because you don't have time varying measures. But can you check based on the later treated areas that you have a balance between your control and your treated based on these variables that are not that don't enter the score of the deforestation risk?
So you'd suggest using roads to see whether. Because I don't think I'm quite following. So is it bringing in the roads, or is it in general looking at how well our predictions
And
do?
any potential characteristics that doesn't enter your machine learning algorithm because you don't have sufficient data to use it? You could perhaps check that you have balance between your control and your treated pixels along these characteristics that maybe on some years you can have data on them. So
Okay.
this road network, but maybe other characteristics in the algorithm.
Yeah, that's a good idea. You can look into that. Yeah, thanks.
Sorry. Just to
yeah.
come back on the question before. So I'm not sure that matching really addresses a question of displacement or spillover. So you could be matching places that are very similar, and the displacement in terms of deforestation risk and the displacement would precisely happen on those that have a similar risk but happen not to be protected. So I wasn't sure about,
Yeah, I mean, that is correct. We're not essentially claiming that we're capturing spillovers here. So it's just like evaluation of.
But your estimate could be capturing spillovers whether you want it or not.
Yeah, so we do robustness checks by excluding a buffer around protected areas. So we could capture local spillovers, which you don't see. We don't capture spillovers that happen somewhere else in the country. So that's what we can't do. Yeah. Okay, we exclude all the units that have less than 20% forest cover. So it's essentially the highlands in the southwest. We also restrict the matches to within biome to ensure ecological comparability. And so on the map, the lighter shaded colors are the treated units, and then the darker shaded colors are the control units by biomes. And yeah, we get pretty good matches. And this is the distribution then using our matched sample. This doesn't include like the time dimension, but just like to get a rough idea. So then we do colorization and an estimation. We cluster the standard errors at the province level. That's the most conservative choice we can make without having, with still having like enough clusters. And so we find an average treatment effect on the treated of 0.19 percentage points. I would say it's borderline significant, but you see that for a long time, nothing happens. And that's kind of like what we've seen in other studies for Bolivia, that some even have like a slightly negative effect. The estimation is about the same for the not yet treated. There's no specific cohorts, like we can't say, okay, it's the early protected areas that really make something or have an impact, or the late ones. But we do see when we look by years that essentially like the last 2 or 3 years that drive this effect. And I think that's just essentially the years where deforestation rates were really, really high. So there's still a substantive effect compared to the background rate of about 0.28 percentage points. So yeah.
What do you make of that, or the sort of dip in the first few years, the forest cover's falling?
This one.
Yeah, in the sort of first 2
Yeah, I'm gonna talk about that in a second. Yeah. So here, the first thing or second thing we do is look at the different quintiles in terms of risks, like before they were established. And we see that the lowest risk quintiles are insignificant. So these places don't really make a difference, while the high risk places are making the biggest difference. Once again, you might seem like, yeah, that's obvious, but you might think that, let's say, middle risk locations would be more effective because they face less illegal activity. And then, so these are the dynamic estimates, or the event study plots for all the quintiles. And that's what Karl just said. We find this dip in the treatment year. And so we kind of think about it as an exploitation effect. So people just know, okay, now it's the last chance we get. So yeah, we gotta deforest. It's not really anticipation, because we do run the estimations including anticipation years. It doesn't really change. So I think that's quite interesting. And it's also happening on all the risk quintiles. So it's not only the extremely high risk that it happens everywhere. And so here we're looking then at trying to get at this multi-objective policy and look at the economic proxies. Like, none of these are significant. So if it was the case that we target low risk areas to kind of don't harm economic productivity, we would assume that there is a negative effect in especially these high risk quintiles. So it is not clear that high additionality places hinder economic development. And then on the left here, we got extinction risk. There's a quite small estimate because it's really takes a lot to change extinction risk, but we find a slightly negative effect. So that means that it's what we would hope for, like protected areas do decrease the risk of extinction. And yet again, doesn't really vary on the axis of risk. And then for carbon, it kind of mirrors forest cover, which is somewhat to be expected, but it also shows that carbon storage is largely driven by forest cover, not really by the density of carbon. So to conclude, we think this is a novel approach to assess additionality in protected areas using these duration models. We find that protected areas in Bolivia during this study period reduced deforestation by 0.19 percentage points per year. This amounts to about 500,000 hectares. And so forest loss in Bolivia would be about 5% higher without these protected areas. And we do find the highest impact in the high risk area. So we find no evidence that multi-objective conservation justifies the current location bias towards low risk areas. We will go into different types of protected areas, so to get an idea of the issue that Marion raised, that maybe some of them have any different targets that we can find from their description. And so these can vary by type, or we can go into different, like, national level, municipality level, and departmental level. Under the policy implications, we still argue that it's worth targeting the high-risk areas. And then it would also make sense to increase monitoring at the time of protected area establishment because of that exploitation effect we've seen. Yeah.
I have a question. Do you know how this highest quintile of deforestation risk compares to the overall distribution? Because since there's this location bias, this might still be quite medium risk relative to the overall country.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So even if for these high rates, they're not extremely risky. So I don't have to percentage numbers off the top of my head, but yeah, it would be interesting to compare that to the national level. Yeah. Okay, go on.
Sorry.
I'm done.
Okay. Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's fine.
I guess I was sort of interested if you could, is there some sort of baseline that would tell you if you would assume like complete additionality? Is that like how much of this is due, like, is there some illegal deforestation going on that makes you think that additionality fall? I was sort of wondering if there's something you'd expect from like complete conservation or if you're looking at these area policies, yeah.
Do you mean like the average effectiveness, or how do you mean?
So I guess I was wondering, so what they're doing is they're closing certain areas to activity. There is some predicted level of forest growth that would occur under a sort of baseline of no economic activity. How does that map to the treatment effect that you see? And that I was just sort of interested because then you could sort of break down how much of the additionality concern is because of sort of ex post illegal deforestation versus this sort of what we think about the sort of potential outcomes ex ante perspective that we kind of like to think about.
Yeah.
Or maybe there isn't, maybe just anecdotally, you know, if there's not a lot of illegal deforestation. That was
Yeah, I have to think about that. I don't have an answer right away. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
Do you have any data on property rights so that you could compare, like, yeah, I guess it's interesting to know what is the counterfactual. Are those matched polygons in matched pixels in private land? Are they in public land?
We do have property rights, not time varying, but we get certain years that we do.
Like some snapshots of what is public, private land. That would be super helpful.
Yeah.
Well, it might not be targeting the highest risk areas for those protected areas. Is it targeting areas that have more environmental quality, whether it's carbon density or value for species protection? Like, is the additionality, the low levels of additionality, because they're just bad at putting things places, or is it because they're prioritizing like high biodiversity or high environmental value areas in some other way?
Yeah, so here we kind of think that they are indeed targeting wrong areas. They're not especially good for extinction risk or carbon. So yeah, our conclusion is that essentially like low risk additionality place. Because I mean, naturally they're also least costly, so there's an argument for it's quite natural to place them there. Yeah.
From Brazil, I know that typically a lot of them target the sources of big rivers. So there's hydrological, like preserving the source of a important basin is typically a priority. So you might want to consider that when you look at the multi-policy objectives, like where important rivers are born is typically really.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, I need to think about how we capture that by distance to water bodies in the but you think like a distinction level of what they're targeted at.
Yeah, typically it's even in the name of the protected area, some in Brazil.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's a good suggestion. Yeah.
I was quite surprised by the zero impact on GDP, because I would guess that, stereotypical sort of what happens when you deforest is that you take forest, potentially unproductive land, and you put it into some productive activity. So do you have any idea of, the areas that you see being deforested, are they going into agriculture? And if so, would the implication of that zero effect just be that it's profoundly unproductive agriculture?
It would go into agriculture mostly. I think we're just looking at the protected areas in terms of like a different outcome. So in these places, because it could go both ways, that GDP could go up because maybe ecotourism or other things happening in the area through protection, but we just, we don't find that either negative or positive.
Do you have any maybe more disaggregated GDP?
No, we don't. Yeah, it's a big problem, yeah.
So what level do you measure GDP?
So we use nighttime lights, and then the grid GDP product is like at night, the GDP product is 9 by 9 kilometers resolution, and then nighttime lights is higher, so 1 by 1 kilometers.
Okay, we're gonna pause there. Okay. Thank you so much. 15 minutes, then we're back again for our last session for lunch.
In Queens next year.
Oh, hi, I'm Karl. Nice to meet you.
Great.
Oh,
Yeah.
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 Yes. 100%. More transparent, more or less stringent, yes. Yeah, no, it's a great question. So, always counterfactual, like, it's the path that the government decided throughout the
Some of my own special collection.
So he was at
Yeah. I know it's, but I don't know which one she does.
Oh, thank you so much.
It was working all time.
No pressure.
Can you turn it off and on? Sometimes we had to read it. And I'm gonna reopen this tab. That's a classic hack.
Everything you told me about it is
I think so.
I'm really very grateful.
great for first.
And then I'm gonna. So we have 2 more presentations before we have lunch / there's going to be a webinar being screened in this room. So we're going to be quite prompt with timings for our next 2 presentations. Yeah.
Oh, 2 questions.
Okay, thanks so much for the organizers for including our paper. My name is Varela, and today I'm going to present a joint work with colleagues based in Sweden, Anna Tomstedt and John Mulligan, as well as in Nairobi, Kenya, Vera Bukaki, Pascal Kinkenboy, and Alan Opokoyo. The overarching question we ask in this period is why do we see people, in particularly residents of informal settlements, locate in high flood risk areas, despite the high cost of doing so? And by shedding light in this question, we hope to contribute to effective policy to ensure the sustainability and resilience of urban centers in the global south. So the starting point of this project is the well-established fact in many different contexts. We've seen many throughout this conference so far that low-income populations experience a higher burden of different environmental risks. So think about air pollution, water pollution, heat-related stress. This is particularly acute and salient in informal settlements throughout the global south, which are forecast to house 1/3 of the global population by mid-century. In these places, the challenges is twofold. On the one hand, the exposures are some of the largest, and the capacity to adapt to those exposures is the smallest. Given the strength or basically of the challenge in the large share of the population that is going to be affected, it's imperative that we think about effective policies to ensure, again, the sustainability of these places. This is highlighted by a recent evidence paper by one of our hosts in this conference this week, the IGC, that highlights how making urban spaces, particularly again in low middle income countries, is one of the greatest challenges of this century. And then the IPCC highlights that to do that, one of the most efficient ways, the most bang for your buck, is targeting informal settlements, again, because the difference between the needs and the capacity to adapt is so large. So When we think about environmental risk in informal settlements, one that is particularly salient is flooding. Informal settlements, by their very own informal nature, developing marginal urban spaces, places that are too risky or undesirable for formal development. They develop without any formal drainage or sanitation plans very often. So these places flood, and they flood often. It's not only the type of catastrophic flooding event that we have in mind, but pretty much every time there is a rainy season, a rainfall, flooding happens in ways that can be very localized. Even a few meters can make a difference. Despite the relevance of this issue, there is little we know about how flooding affects the livelihoods of residents in informal settlements. One large reason for this is that these are settings that are complicated to study. They lack formal censuses and formal addresses. There is a lot of turnover of the population, and are oftentimes dangerous even for external researchers to go into a study. But again, thinking with the objective of formulating effective policy, we need to understand what are the incentives that make these people locate into these high flood risk areas. Is it a trade-off that they are making between a cheap place to live and they're willing to accept for that higher flood risk? Or is it, as we have some anecdotal evidence happening in our setting, a lack of information on the flooding risk of a particular dwelling they might be moving into? So in this paper, we address this question, and for that, we collect a comprehensive data set over several years, a representative cross-section in Kibera, which is a large informal settlement in Nairobi. We combined this with a localized flood risk map. This is work in progress, as I'm going to talk about in a second. By combining these two data sets, we are able to examine how housing and household outcomes change along flood risk. We focus on housing outcomes because they provide a revealed preference of how these households make trade-offs and think about risk. We also then think about potential mechanisms that may have derived into this empirical facts that we observed, and one of the ones we think about is the role of asymmetric information and tenants not knowing the exact flood risk of a particular dwelling they were moving into, and to guide our understanding along these lines, we developed a simple model. So what are some of the results we find so far? We find a strong sorting in this neighborhood according to flood risk. Those with the lowest incomes locate in the highest flood risk areas. We also see that rents decline with flood risk, but we have some evidence of these rents plateauing, leveling off in the highest, for the highest flood risk areas. We find this leveling off, this sort of horizontal gradient between rents and flood risk is starker for those who have been living in a particular dwelling for a shorter period of time. Then we also find that in high flood risk areas, residents tend to stay for shorter periods. There is a higher turnover of the population. And they are also more likely to have moved from more remote rural areas. Then we think about, again, the mechanisms that may have resulted into this empirical findings. And we find some support with for information gaps, particularly again for those who have just moved to a particular dwelling. However, we still find large segment of the population, particularly those with low incomes, that we assume, given their choices, that should have full information is still residing in high flow risk areas. So if information explains partly the patterns, not in their entirety. So moving to the background, why Kibera, and why is this a compelling settings to study housing outcomes and how they change with flood risk? Kibera is one of the largest and one of the oldest informal settlements in Kibera, very close to the downtown of Nairobi. It has a history of dispute land ownership ever since Kenya declared its independence, gained its independence in the 1960s. residents of Kibera were not given land titles, and this again continues to this day. Today, the land is the jure, owned by the government, but there is a very active rental market. The owners owned the structures or buildings, and they rent them out. These are, all the research has shown that these are usually well-connected actors, elites, even civil servants in Nairobi. I'm going to refer to these people loosely throughout the presentation as landlords, but again, they don't own the land, they own the structure of the building on top of the land. Kibera, again representative of other informal settlements, was developed along a riverbank. In this map here in the bottom, I'm showing you an elevation model of Kibera, and you can see clearly the streams in yellow crossing the settlement. And as a result, it floods, and it floods often. Every time there is particularly during the rainy seasons, the 2 rainy seasons throughout the year. Yes.
In the absence of a formal drainage system, does location closer to a river offer some benefits like easier sanitation access or something?
Yeah, we don't. That's a very good question. We don't find evidence of that. I mean, we focus on 6 sites within Kibera. So I want to talk about in a second. They're pretty homogeneous within site. We relied on variation within site, so we don't find that could be a potential mechanism. Yeah, just to show, or perhaps visualize better what do we mean by lack of drainage. These are some pictures on the top of Kibera during the rainy season. You can see how it makes it hard to move around, to access places. And on the bottom, you see some photos taken during the dry season. You see the drainage channels are rudimentary, not well kept, and again, prone to flood in localized ways. So, what data do we then get in this context? We, as I mentioned, collect data in 6 sites in Kibera.
I'm sorry, just before the data, can you speak just a little bit about the insurance market and the availability of it for different people?
So this is we collect data on a semi-illegal markets, basically. These are, again, people who don't own the land, build a structure, and then rent it out. There is no formal insurance per se. We collect some qualitative data on relationships between landlords and tenants, like who should deal with, if there is a flood damages my house, and we do see some evidence of conversations with landlords, but there is no, again, formal insurance market. Yeah. Any other questions at this point? Okay, so we collect again data on 6 sites. These sites are 200 meters in diameter, so it's small and homogeneous within sites. So then what we do, it's important not collect data in a cross section. We don't get to get evidence of particular year. That could have been a dry or a wet one. So we collect data over several years in cycles. Each of the cycles contains 2 sites. Then these areas don't have a formal census or address, so we create our own. But we do the sampling framing in 2 steps. First, with satellite images, we delineate these structures, these buildings. We then check this on the field. It's really difficult actually to know where one building ends and other starts in this really dense environment. Then we randomly select structures within these 200 meters, and then we go into the structures and count dwellings. These are 1-room dwellings that usually occupy 1 household, and select doors randomly within the structures. This ends up being, a footnote in a paper, but let me highlight how complicated getting this data was, gaining the trust of these people. We were only able to do this because one of our authors in the paper who was born and raised in Kibera, know this area very well, and then we could get this data. So, as I mentioned, there is a lot of turnover in the population. So to ensure that the cross-section is representative, we select new households that move in. So we have a panel of some households, but otherwise, again, a representative cross-section. And this also allows us to see who is moving in, etc. So what is some of the characteristics of the people in our sample? We see that the rents they pay are around 2,400 Kenyan shillings. For reference, this is around 13 pounds. we see that this is similar, the rent they pay per month, similar order the magnitude of their weekly income. So then this also challenges this narrative of these people being squatters or living in a place for free. They're actually paying a significant share of their income towards rent. There is a large, again, turnover of the population. The median resident has lived in a dwelling for somewhat less than 5 years, and 10% of our sample have lived there less than 9 months. Accordingly, we see that only 15% of our sample has never moved from the dwelling they're currently residing, and we see 9% have moved from rural areas. These places also flood often, as again expected. 35% of our sample has suffered a recent flooding episode, and we also collect data on some of the cost that this flood has come with, damages to assets these households may own, like cattle, TVs, radios, phones. We also report injuries, even a few deaths during our period that the households associated with flooding, and also record costly adaptive measures that residents have applied in their households to protect them against flood. So you can think of raising the step in front of the doors, waterproofing our walls, etc. Yes.
Okay. Are these costs self-reported, or is it something where you like break it down?
Yeah, unfortunately, they're self-reported. So what we do is we do ask them, did you have a phone? Was it damaged during the flood? Did you repair it? How much did it cost to repair it? Or if you didn't repair it, how much do you think it would have cost? We want to, again, this cost to not be constrained by any, affected by any income constraints. But yeah, self-reported. So those are our left-hand side variables. Now, what about flood risk? Our right-hand side variable, right? So to get started, what we do is we flood, again, now the self-reported flood episodes. You can see this in this map on the top, where the blue dots are floods. So this also addresses your question partially, that we see floods all over, not just near the streets. Again, because flood happens also because of insufficient drainage. As a first step to translate this into a flood risk, we apply a kernel density estimator, basically to smooth out these observations. So, because what we find, when we saw this result, we thought, is this completely random, right? Is this like no structure at all? We rule out, we test and rule out that. We find a strong spatial correlation, but it dissipates really quickly. Basically, the experience of your immediate or nearby neighbors are predictive of what is happening to you, but again, it dissipates quickly. So through this smoothing exercise, what we are doing, that the risk associated to a particular dwelling doesn't depend on your experience, but rather on the experience of your neighbors. We also say that this is the first step. What we are working towards is using this as a validation data and develop a physically derived measure of risk with a hydrological model. This is proving to be a non-trivial exercise, because then we have to take into account, what's happening with drainage channels. Just to show you where we're going, this is where we started, in which the flood model only captured what happened in rivers. This was insufficient. Now we're moving towards something that looks more what we wanted to have, again, flooding through drainage channels, etc. So stay tuned, hopefully soon.
Sorry, just on that picture there, the idea is that the drainage, incorporating the drainage channels, is incorporating the topography of the drainage channels, or also the presumably potentially endogenous to local characteristics, amount that it's filled with trash and this sort of thing.
Right. So so that's a very good question, Claire. You pointed it out before, and we've been thinking about this, how to do this. These hydrological models, you can incorporate topographies and also parameters about the land. You can, one of them is infiltration of the land. So what we're thinking about is changing those parameters. Again, what infiltration should you expect if the drainage is clean, or if the channel is clean, or if there is garbage on there. So we hope, again, to have at least some boundaries, right, on what we should expect flooding to happen with rubbish or not. What is going to be hard, it's to and we may think of ways of doing this at temporal series, basically knowing particular point in time when it rained, where there was rubbish or not. Yeah, but again, we might be able to get into that with some satellite images, but we have to think more.
You might be able to correlate it with local characteristics and try and control it.
Right, there may be places that are always,
Yeah.
you know, full of God. Yeah, this is something we can look at. Yeah. Okay. So, so then what we're going to use is this measure of flood risk that, you know, is residualized, and we remove variation coming from sites, and so it's within sites and with time, and then use again this as a measure of flood risk. So what I'm going to show you now is a series of figures. They all follow the same structure. So on the x-axis is this measure of flood risk, low flood risk, high flood risk. So you get a sense of the number of observations we use to run our inference. We have a histogram here on the bottom with the same x-axis. And then on the y-axis, a series of housing outcomes and household outcomes. To compare apples to apples, we also residualize this and remove time and site fixed effects. So the first figure we're showing you here is household income in logs. And what we see is a clear downward gradient. Note that this is not something that we ex ante were expecting to see so clearly. This is a really small neighborhood already, housing some of the poorest people within Nairobi, right? But we see that even when we zoom in into this neighborhood scale, there is those that are the poorest of the poorest live in the highest risk area. Then we look at rents, and we also see that rents decline with a flood risk. We see some evidence, again, we rely on fewer observations here, of leveling or plateauing in the high risk areas. We also remove variation from some property characteristics we have. You might be concerned that properties here are less nice, say, for some reasons. So we have data on type of walls, type of roofs, access to toilet, access to electricity, etc. After removing this variation, we see that the relationship holds. Yes.
Sorry, I came in late, so this
No
may have
problem.
been answered. But the question you're asking about flooding, self-reported,
Right.
it's about whether it reaches up over your doorstep?
Yes, that is important, right? We did ask, has your house been flooded? And the trend enumerator to say this is water coming from the floor. It's not water that is coming after it rains because your roof is.
So we have similar data for Freetown and Sierra Leone, and the wealthier households build their homes up higher. They
Right.
have more concrete flooring.
Right.
So they're not living in different places. They are
Right.
to some extent, but they're changing the way their homes operate.
Exactly. Yeah.
So do you have sort of any understanding of the actual flood height relative to the flood
Right.
height relative to the floor?
We do ask them, have you, were there any protective measures against flooding once you move to a dwelling? One of them is a raised foundation. So we don't have the exact height, but we do know if there have been raised. We also ask them if they themselves implemented these measures after moving. So we do have some data on that. Yeah. Yes.
Do you have a sense for what is the cost of a flood conditional on a flood? Just wonder whether the place where you see the rent plateau out and the
Right.
cost is about the same.
So that I'm going to show you, it's in a bottom, but hopefully I'll get there, the cost of associated with the flood. So we have some data again on damages to assets, on injuries, just as a preview, these costs are also increasing. But to your question, we haven't, and we love, to hear more about your thoughts, quantify those costs. Again, to be able to put again, say on the injuries, on the deaths, on the longer time to get to a place, to be able again to quantify those and understand to what extent are these fairly priced within these rents. Yeah, this is a next step that will address your question. Okay, so before getting or showing you the rest of the empirical facts, let's just take a step back and think about what are the potential mechanisms, again, that could have led to this path. The first we consider is imperfect information, meaning the tenant doesn't know, again, given this highly localized flooding, the particular flood risk of a place they might be moving into. This is the NGO we partner with, has some anecdotal evidence of this being a problem. This is something that also policymakers in the area talk about. we consider other mechanisms, but then the second most salient, given this strong gradient we find between flood risk and income, is that this is not a market failure. This is not a lack of information. Households are fully informed. They're just making, again, a trade-off between lower rents and high flood risk. And this is, what Michael Winston and Garcia in their environmental economics paper mentioned is a really high marginal utility of consumption, right? They have lower incomes and spends, basically it's efficient, rational to spend less in rent. So going back to the information channel, again, what we should expect, how we should expect these outcomes to change if indeed there is a lack of information. We assume that the landlord knows the flood risk of a particular dwelling, the rent they're renting, a tenant might not. Then the landlord, anticipating behavior of the tenant, sets a rent. Each tenant is matched with the landlord. The tenant decides to accept a rent agreement if they derived a positive utility from doing so, a utility theta of renting a dwelling with a flood risk little f. Otherwise, they prefer to wait it out one period, and this would incur a cost equal to C. You can think of this of not moving immediately to Kibera, staying longer with family, etc. How we should expect rents in particular to change with flood risk under this setting. In the first case, if all tenants are fully informed, so all tenants know exactly the F of their dwelling they're moving into. We should expect, as we assume this utility decreases with flooding. No one likes their house to be flooded. We should see rents decline as well. The landlords would set a rent that gives the tenant indifferent between renting or not. Higher rents will leave their places vacant. Lower rent will not be profit maximized. What happens then if all, on the other extreme case, all renters are naive? They don't know exactly the flooding risk of a dwelling they're moving into. We assume they know enough about flooding happening in an area to be able to derive on expectation the utility they will get from renting a particular place. But again, because they're not able to discern the exact F, where we should see rents being basically flat across the flood risk. What happens, we do in the paper, if we have a share of informed or naive renters, what we conclude is that in equilibrium, what we should see is the landlords of high-risk areas setting prices that only naive renters will accept. They extract a larger surplus from them. Then the opposite happens in the low flood risk areas. Rent prices that only the informed will accept. Then in intermediate with areas, we should see prices, again, that both will accept, and this is to ensure, again, that their place does not remain vacant. So some predictions of this simple model, we should see if renters are informed, the rents decreasing, otherwise naive, flatter rent gradient, and in this combination we should even see localized increases or non-monotonicity of rents. There was two questions. Yes.
So you have data on whether they moved, right?
Yes.
And it looked like a substantial, about 70% moved within Kibera.
Right.
Can you see if this happens? Like, are they moving from high flood risk to low flood?
Right, and this answer is going to be a bit frustrating as well, but we haven't yet exploited these dynamics. I was talking about the panel data, now again, frustratingly say I'm not exploiting that. Again, this is the next step. The moment this is a cross-section given flood risk, yes, but hopefully. Note though that this is throughout Kibera, right? So it's basically throughout the whole settlement. It may not necessarily be these particular sites. Yeah, another question.
It might also be an interesting intermediate case where, as a renter, I know in general the big areas that flood or not, but then within those big areas, which exact house floods or doesn't flood, I don't know. And then with your nice data, you might be able to it's localized, get a disentanglement.
Right, that's a very good point as well. And I didn't quite get into all of the details of how we selected the sites. But basically, we already did that. These are sites that tend to flood. So basically, this first step you mentioned, we already did through the selection. And then, so this is basically within sites, these localized changes in flooding.
But then I guess at the higher level, the spatial sorting that you're talking about, which is important, will also operate on this margin of.
I see what you mean. Yes, yes, yes. So this is something that we can, once we have the hydrological model of the whole area, we can tell. May also say that, again, this is a data scarce environment, but there is a very nice paper by Marx and co-authors a few years ago on ethnic patronage in a Kenyan slum. And they have data it's a cross-section data throughout Kibera. And what we find that the variables we have in common, rents, incomes, they're pretty similar. So we know again that at least with this data point seem to be similar, but again, yes.
If the flood risk is so localized, how inconvenient is it that, hey, if my house is flooded today, let me move to a neighbor's house, which is 20 meters away. So maybe the cost to the individual is not that much.
We do collect cost and see that they increase. So we, based on this data, assume this is a significant cost. I think I have 1 minute. So let me really quickly say that, again, rents expect to change. We should also expect tenure to be, again, shorter here. After one period, after having a lived experience in a place, these naive renters are now informed, realize they're overpaying, and want to move out. And we should also expect those moving from more remote areas to live in these high risk areas. So, again, 30 seconds. What we find if we try to tackle this type of naive residents, we look at those have moved recently to a place, those have been in this particular slide live in a place less than 12 months, and see that these the gradient again of rents flattens up, right? We cannot rule out that those in the highest risk areas pay different rents than those in the lowest risk areas. For those who have been living there longer, this downward trend continues. We find also, we look at a length of tenure, now is non-monotonic, but again seems to suggest that the shortest tenures, living there in the dwelling for a shorter period of time, higher in the highest flood risk areas, lowest, the opposite, lowest in the high risk areas, staying longer in the safest of areas. Accordingly, we also see that those that have never moved tend to locate in the safest of areas. And then some evidence of those who are moving from rural areas, again, more remote, less connected, tending to locate in these high flood risk areas. So tying back to these mechanisms I just showed you, we find some evidence of, again, information through the lens of a model, information playing a role. But we still see, again, a large share of the population is staying in these high flow risk areas. So this is suggestive, we argue, of poverty-driven trade-offs playing a role. To make this a statement, we also rule out alternative mechanisms, including, the flood-related costs that we talked about. So to conclude, we then collect a rich data set in a data scarce setting and find, again, explore household outcomes how they change with flood risk, and find some evidence of information playing a role, but again, not explaining the whole situation. Let me also emphasize how radically different policy implications these two mechanisms would have, right? The first, if it were information, again, as is being touted by policy makers in the area, a relatively cheaper campaign of informing households will suffice. If it's a structural constraints of these households making an efficient, rational decision, it would be a lot more complicated, right? We need to think of increasing their housing choice sets of house or having safer housing options with similar rents. And again, stay tuned to this hydrological model to exploit the dynamic panel effects as you were asking. Thank you so much, and sorry for.
Oh, it's going. Is it? Yeah. Yes. Great. Okay.
All right. Thanks. Really cool work on this project's going to be really complimentary, so I'm excited for that. I'm Lucy Hackett. I'm a PhD candidate at UC Berkeley. I'm on the market this year, and this work is joint with my co-author Carolina Rodriguez Zamora at the Banco de Mexico. I want to start us off by defining land subsidence, for those of you who don't know, or just subsidence or sinking. I'll use those three words interchangeably in this presentation. Land subsidence is a common groundwater externality worldwide that involves the sinking of land areas due to groundwater depletion. So as the water table falls in a basin, the land areas overlying that water table sink down, literally losing elevation. And land subsidence is an externality because aquifers are hydraulically connected over space. So if you pump groundwater in one location and draw down the aquifer, eventually that will equalize, leading to land subsidence in other potentially fairly distant locations. Over 120 million people worldwide are estimated to live in a place that's sinking at a fast rate of over 10 to 20 centimeters per year. And this is particularly a big problem in major world cities that are heavily reliant on groundwater. So on this map of case studies, you'll see light up prominent examples like Jakarta, Beijing, Tehran, Houston, and where I'll be talking about today, Mexico City. And all of these places have documented subsidence rates above 20 centimeters per year. So I'm saying 20 centimeters per year. It can be hard to think about what that really means. And a good example is this picture from the Central Valley in California, which sank at an average rate of 17 centimeters per year, which over a 50-year period led to a 9-meter elevation drop in this area, as visualized by these placards on this telephone pole that show you what the altitude had been in that area in decades going back. Now, this is a rural area. The plants don't seem to mind too much, but in major cities, there's a lot of physical capital sitting on this ground. A 9-meter elevation drop is going to present substantial problems for physical infrastructure like buildings that will experience things like fissures, cracking, tilting, water infiltration, and eventually loss of structural integrity. And public infrastructure is also really vulnerable to subsidence, especially when this is uneven over larger spatial areas. So you think of water mains or sewer lines that will become cracked and leak because of the uneven pressures on them. Roads will see sinkholes and fissures open up, and you'll also see new patterns of flooding emerge as more and more water is being directed to places as the slope literally changes in an area. And so we'll be studying Mexico City. I want to show you two examples of what this can look like in Mexico City. Here in this road that has a subway running through the middle, which is going to be a particularly bad problem, you can see these construction barriers that some are sinking down into the ground and then others are actually being pushed out of the ground as the ground unevenly sinks away from them. And here on the right, I'm showing you a more subtle example of what this can look like in a building, where this building downtown is actually, this is the foundation unevenly emerging out of the ground as the road sinks away from it. And an economic mechanism we're going to be interested in this project is that in survey evidence, we find that these kinds of long run and slow moving impacts to homes are very difficult for households to forecast, despite how spatially predictable subsidence is in a general sense. So in this paper, we'll be asking what are the costs of subsidence in Mexico City? And to structure our answer to that question, we're going to propose an equilibrium model of the housing market that incorporates an evolving environmental hazard. And this will allow us to systematically think about how these kinds of evolving hazards that have both realized damages and expected future damages are going to respond in a housing market where housing is being rebuilt all the time. So to do this, we first need to measure subsidence, and we create the longest measure ever and most granular measurement of sinking for Mexico City ever made, which involves processing over 5 terabytes of raw radio wave-based satellite measures. And this will give us an 18-year panel of sinking rates at 100-meter resolution, which we can use to map onto individual properties in our data. We'll then turn to a model of the housing market that incorporates this evolving hazard. And to give you a very quick flavor, we're going to think about housing demand that dislikes how much subsidence has accrued to a home from the time it was built until present, but that may face frictions when evaluating how severe future subsidence will be. And on the supply side, we're going to think about a housing developer who operates in a fully built up space. And so their business model is going to be to buy up, built up plots, demolish those units, and build new units who haven't sunk at all yet, but that will in the future. Yeah, do you have a question?
I mean, does the type of development change once you have information about the risks? Because I just know that like in the Boston area, there is a geological survey that's done before new construction, and then
Yeah, the Mexico City construction code is very tightly regulated because it's an active seismic zone. However, we're gonna see that at the severity of subsidence we see in this setting, it's almost impossible to kind of build your way off of that. A building that loses 2 meters of elevation is gonna be like, there are very limited ways to kind of adapt to that. And the few ways that there are, which involve, for example, putting pylons really deep into the ground, are only gonna be cost effective for the largest skyscrapers in Mexico City. And less than 2% of homes in my data have any kind of adaptive foundation, for example. Yes.
We're into geophysics, but the risk of this gradual subsidence, how correlated, you mentioned the seismic risk, how correlated is that going to be with other, the kind of major types of natural hazards that?
It will be in the cross-section very correlated with seismic risk. The types of geologies that are prone to sinking are also prone to having severe seismic damage. And so our empirical strategy is going to leverage quasi-random variation in sinking that gets away from this spatial correlation.
Control.
Somehow related to previous questions, if I understand correctly, there's no way to anticipate this and adapt it ex ante, right? You're saying.
No, so this, I'm going to show you, this is extremely correlated in the cross section. And so, for example, the Mexico City construction code will be tighter in areas that tend to sink more. And I was just saying my empirical strategy will leverage kind of quasi-random variation. But yes, thank you for clarifying that. Okay, so we're gonna write down this model, and from the model, we're gonna drive some key intuition about how to think about this in this setting, as well as estimating equations that we then take to the data in 2 empirical steps to estimate the key parameters we need to conduct welfare analysis here. The first is estimating the direct cost of subsidence to a home, both realized and expected future subsidence, which we do using a quasi-experimental design that leverages random variation and sinking across the city. And we're going to pair this with novel survey evidence on both the impacts of subsidence and residents' beliefs about and information forming processes about subsidence to study this question of information and capitalization. We'll then turn to the supply side, estimating the elasticity of new development to subsidence, and pull all this together to estimate the total cost of subsidence in Mexico City, which will give us a back of the envelope estimator for potential tax on groundwater extraction in this context, which is the externality generating action. We're also going to quantify the benefits of information policies. Let's say we can't do anything about subsidence, but we can alleviate the information frictions that we'll find in this project. And we're going to be able to use our model to quantify the potential benefits of those. For example, in Mexico, as in many low and middle income countries, there are no disclosure laws for systematic risks. And we can think about the benefits of implementing such a policy. And then if we have time for it today, although I'm happy to chat about it later if not, we'll also conduct cost benefit analyses of alternative policies that could directly offset groundwater pumping, facilitating recharge of the aquifer. If we can't do anything about sinking directly, there may be gains we can make by directly mitigating the problem. Yes.
Have you considered the mortgage implications here? Like, do banks provide loans? And
interestingly, we find no mortgage penalty for subsidence risk in Mexico City. Default rates are extremely low in this setting because many mortgages are financed by the public entity, but it's pretty shocking that we don't find that. I'll also say that our data uses mortgage appraisals, but most homes in Mexico are not financed with mortgages. Okay, so first I'm going to tell you how we measure subsidence, and we'll get to some good descriptive information about this hazard in the setting before turning to the model. We can measure subsidence at fine geographic and temporal scale using a process called synthetic aperture radar, or SAR interferometry. I know at least one person in this room knows what that is. To give you a brief overview, how SAR interferometry works is that a satellite emits energy at the Earth in the form of a radio wave, and then records a transformation of how many oscillations that wave undergoes before coming back to the satellite. Because the details of how this is stored, this wave is essentially meaningless on its own, but if you compare the difference between 2 passes, you get a highly accurate measure of how much the altitude has changed in a location over time. This is kind of the go-to method of physicists that study land subsidence or other land deformations like volcanic eruptions or ice sheet changes. And so we have a really good idea of kind of how these measurements behave and how accurate they are, which tends to be on the order of a couple millimeters of in terms of the sinking rate per year. So we're going to stitch together existing measurements from a team of geophysicists that studied this in Mexico City with original interferometry using the ALOS-1 satellite from 2008 to 2011 and the Sentinel-1 satellite from 2021 to 2025 to create a harmonized 100-meter grid pixel level of subsidence rates in the city.
Can you do this along this entire time scale you're showing?
We do it for these two periods. Each of these on their own is stretches our ability to store and manage data. It's computationally infeasible to create such a long.
No, of course.
Yeah.
But this exercise you show, you're somehow holding the housing stock fixed, right? So you pass over the same place with the same buildings, and then you can identify. So if within this period, you know, the buildings change and this sort of thing, do you do it?
So our measures are going to exclude those kinds of things, and we show that you can't predict construction with our measure at all. It's because of how satellites containing star instruments pass approximately every 90 days of our location. So it's extremely easy to purge out like outlier increases in elevation. Yeah. Yeah.
I was thinking back to that picture you showed where the subsidence is very dramatic in a very small, within an 100-meter pixel. How well can you how does one pick up on these like micro differences that might bear a lot of the cost?
We won't be able to measure those micro distances. We'll be focused on unevenness across neighborhoods, which is the primary risk factor for public infrastructure. In a companion project, though, we are using point estimators of subsidence to quantify damage curves. So that'll be a different project.
Yeah, and how predictable are those small ones versus these like general neighborhood wide?
I wouldn't be able to say, yeah, because I'm not measuring them. Sorry. So from this process, we get a really rich picture of what subsidence looks like in the city, which is incredibly spatially concentrated. This is the sinking rate in 2010, and you can see on the eastern part of the city sinks at a fast rate of about 20 to 25 centimeters per year. So this area is losing a meter every 4 to 5 years. And despite the fact that all groundwater pumping is actually exclusively conducted outside Mexico City to provide the city with water, these fast rates are concentrated here on the east because these are the most vulnerable geologies. And this cross-section is representative of really any cross-section you could plot for the city with some changes. We've had some upticks in sinking here in recent years that have been due to extreme drought events that have lowered the groundwater level substantially. You can also look at how sinking changes over space. And here I'm showing you the absolute deviation in a 500-meter grid cell sinking relative to the neighbors around it, which is going to be the primary risk factor for things like water mains and sewer lines and road fissures. And as you might expect, this is concentrated around the fastest sinking areas, as well as some geological features that are relatively stuck in place. So the places around them that sink very unevenly relative to those around them. Despite how broadly predictable subsidence is over space, though, we find in our survey evidence, which I'll tell you more about a little later, that residents are caught off guard by sinking. So here I'm showing you a measure of what you could expect 5-year sinking on a respondent's property be from our satellite measure, as measured by the average rate times 5, against the probability that a respondent reports that sinking on their property has been worse than they expected since they moved in. The important thing to note in this graph is that this line has an upward slope, which tells us that residents don't move into sinking properties necessarily eyes wide open about what they're getting into. You could think that if that were true, this line would be flat, as we would have people going into high-risk areas saying, yes, it's high risk, but there are good reasons for me to live here. And this is our first piece of evidence that that's not quite what's happening. We find that this is robust to controlling things like people's risk aversion, discount factor, socioeconomic status, and we find other evidence complementing this as well. But for now, we're going to use this to just motivate the inclusion of the potential for information frictions in our theoretical model. So in our model, we're going to want to incorporate these key facts. First, the potential that subsidence is not well capitalized into home values, especially future subsidence, which can be difficult to observe. And the fact that subsidence evolves slowly and damages homes along with it. I'm going to walk you through the model in words and show you a toy example of what equilibrium looks like. We model 3 market participants in discrete time. They're going to participate in ownership market for housing and a rental market for housing. And these 2 markets are going to be really intimately linked in our model. Start with renters. We model renters who make a discrete choice over which plot in the city they want to live on. and they dislike living in units that have sunk a lot from the time of construction until date. And this disutility is going to be captured by a parameter gamma, which is less than 0, indicating that renters dislike living in a building that's cracked or tilted or that they have to spend extra on maintenance for. These renters are going to rent properties from property managers who are the ones who actually own housing. And because property managers then need to think about the present value of all future rents, they're the ones that are going to form expectations about future rents and therefore future sinking. However, we model they may have information frictions about this sinking, which will be captured by our second key parameter, theta. Whereas theta goes to 0, they systematically underestimate how severe future sinking will be, and a theta of equal to 1 will indicate they have rational expectations about future sinking. This separation between renters and property managers is going to be really helpful because we can separately quantify the utility losses to renters who like paying for cheap rent, and to property managers who hold the bag for the asset value of the home. And a lot of our welfare impacts are going to come from the fact that they're overpaying for assets that will essentially depreciate too quickly because of subsidence. And then finally, on supply, we model a housing developer who looks around in each period and decides which plots they want to redevelop. Where development means that they've purchased units, demolish those, and rebuild new units there. And those new units, essentially, we just model simply that they will sink, abstracting from these adaptive investments. The housing developer's problem in purchasing units and then building is going to allow us to separate the impact of realized sinking, which lowers prices and actually acts as an efficient way that the market draws in redevelopment to sinking areas. You think that if a capital stock is appreciated, that's exactly the place you're going to want to renew investment, and that's what our developers will do. This mechanism in the model will be perfectly efficient, but what won't be efficient is if information frictions affect the capitalization of risk into homes. That will lead developers to have a too high incentive to build new units in those places. We can see this in the following diagram of our equilibrium. So in each period, on each plot, we can think of a housing stock where if it's not redeveloped, we have housing stock fixed at a certain value. And if it is redeveloped, you have upward sloping supply that comes from the developers decreasing returns to scale. Demand in this market comes from property managers whose demand comes from the expected rents they expect to receive on that plot. However, if they have kind of too rosy expectations about how severe future sinking will be, this demand will be systematically too high, which will lead to too much housing eventually being put on that plot given redevelopment. This will then translate down to the rental market, where rental demand, given by our choice probabilities on the renter side, will equalize rents to that housing stock amount. And as the unit sinks, these rents will decay over time as that unit becomes less and less attractive to live in. Yes.
And so are renters informed about subsidence risk?
We model that renters can perfectly observe realized sinking, and that's the only thing they care about because they can move in every period. They don't worry about forming expectations. Yeah. Yes.
So I might be misunderstanding this, but why does the rental actually drop as much as the ownership, the prices? Because I imagine the cost to ownership is much higher than, I mean, renters can move, right? So,
right.
So if there is destruction of property because of this, the renter does not bear the cost. So why would they?
The renter doesn't bear the cost, which is why they are just their rents compensate them for the disutility of living in that unit. All those costs of the asset being destroyed are going to be held by property managers. Yes. So from this model, we're going to take away 3 kind of insights. First, I think is pretty straightforward. Expected future sinking on a plot lowers housing supply there. This is a classic disamenity argument. If the place is less nice to live in overall, you'll have less demand, and that will lead to less total units on that area. However, realized sinking plays a fundamentally different economic role in this setting, and it increases the rate of redevelopment by reducing the opportunity cost of demolition. Essentially, societal costs are really low of pulling down a place that is beat up and terrible to live in. And this again in the model is perfectly efficient. What is inefficient is if information frictions inflate demand for plots that are sinking. This will lead to oversupply of units in those areas.
So by information frictions, you mean people underestimate the probability of flooding. What happens if the information frictions just mean that people are on average correct, but there's dispersion around that mean? Which would be consistent with the graph you showed earlier, because you get selection into purchase. The more optimistic people select into purchasing the places that are gonna
Yeah,
subside.
so
I think they probably have different welfare implications, the two models.
they're actually very similar. So in the real estate literature, they have these really great models, exactly this selection on who knows what into where they live. And they show that, yes, exactly as you say, the least informed will select into the worst areas, and this will lead to an even worse inflation of the price there. So the welfare implication will be very simple, though we don't model that heterogeneity explicitly. As long as that is.
In the model I'm thinking about, ex ante welfare is optimal. Because people have their beliefs and I judge their welfare relative to their beliefs are on average correct, there's no welfare cost.
Yeah, maybe we can touch base after, but if people are systematically wrong, you should estimate ex ante welfare using rational expectations, which would be negative. But yeah, let's talk more. So from this model, we're going to derive the following estimating equations. Do I have 5 minutes? Okay. Where we can estimate the relationship between log prices and realized sinking. And then with a couple more restrictions, we can pull expected future sinking out of the residual and separately try to identify coefficients on both realizations and expectations. So this is going to come with challenges. And on the supply side, we leverage the redevelopment decision as an estimating equation for the supply elasticity, where this comes from the coefficient on log prices. And note here again that realized sinking, because gamma is negative, actually increases the probability of redevelopment because of this depreciation force. And the data we're going to use to estimate these is first the universe of mortgage appraisals in Mexico City, which we use to identify repeat appraisals from the same building over time. And we document that these are closely related to sale prices and that deviations from the sale price are not correlated with subsidence. Because of some of the challenges I'll highlight in estimating our coefficient and expectations, we're going to complement this with an original and representative survey on both the impacts of subsidence and residents' beliefs about them. And then on the supply side, we'll use a survey of housing developers called the DIME, whose access is facilitated by the Mexican Central Bank and my co-author, which identifies at least 70% of all new builds in Mexico City, and which will map onto our appraisal data to assign each appraisal an indicator for whether it was subsequently redeveloped or not. So our first estimating equation proposes an estimator for both gamma, that is utility from subsidence, and theta, which is how much future sinking is discounted. The first challenge is that we have to take a stand on expectations in order to estimate this, which will almost certainly be misspecified, leading to classical attenuation bias in our estimator. And that our controls may directly control for some of information set. For example, a plot level average will be captured in our property level fixed effect. We're going to try to get around this by relaxing our fixed effects and specifying these expectations in multiple ways. But because we're somewhat fundamentally limited here, this is our motivation for complementing this with survey evidence as well that gives us more qualitative an idea of how these information frictions operate. Our second challenge is identification. While our property level fixed effects allow us to control for quality differences between buildings, and they break up the spatial autocorrelation in subsidence, we still need a parallel trends assumption that housing markets of sinking homes are evolving similarly to housing markets of non-sinking homes. An assumption that we validate with a battery of tests and placebo checks that I will skip for now in the interest of time. And turning straight to our result, we find that property level sinking, no matter how we specify expectations, either as a plot level AR1 process or as a perfect foresight estimator, property level sinking, a meter of sinking decreases appraised values by 6%, meaning that the average home in our sample lost 1.5% of its value over a 10-year period. However, regardless of how we specify expectations and even relaxing our fixed effects quite a bit and focusing on new builds, we find no role for expected sinking to enter these price relationships. And the biggest value we can estimate for theta is 0.08, although none of these are statistically different from 0. And recall that a value of theta of 1 would be rational expectations. I'll show us one more set of results from our survey, which is from the question, how can you know if a home may have future issues with sinking? This gives some idea of how people are forming expectations. And the thing I want you to notice here is that separating respondents by high and low sinking intensity. And here I'm showing you just a subset of the answers that are related to ex-ante ways of knowing if a home could have issues before they've had them. So these include asking around, knowing the construction quality, or knowing something about the location. And on all these measures, we find that residents of low sinking areas are the more likely to report these kinds of measures than high sinking, which is exactly evidence of this sorting that we would expect of the least informed overpaying for units in high-risk areas. And then finally, on the demand side, I'm going to show some quick evidence of mechanisms of why people dislike sinking at all in a building. We can do this first using some descriptive evidence from our survey. We find that sinking significantly increases maintenance spending on a place, as you would expect. Although interestingly, we don't see evidence of complementary investments and types of maintenance that are likely unrelated to subsidence. Using our appraiser data, we also see that a meter of sinking decreases the appraised useful life remaining of the structure by over 4 years. So we can see that sinking is really degrading the physical quality despite this increased maintenance. And then finally, looking at our measure of uneven sinking, all of this has been about plot-specific sinking, but if my plot is sinking and that's correlated with uneven sinking around me, I may be just picking up some of that in my coefficient. And indeed, we find that's the case. Our effect is slightly attenuated when also accounting for uneven sinking between neighborhoods. And we find that at average amounts of unevenness, a home loses 2.4% of its value. So our last empirical step before turning to welfare is to estimate the supply elasticity, which again, we do using our redevelopment decision. Here, our challenge is that cost shocks are likely correlated with prices. And we address this by using our measure of uneven sinking as an instrument in a control function approach to estimating this equation. Yeah, Alan.
Since you have very granular data, can you estimate granular gamma and granular theta, like neighborhood specific or higher than neighborhood specific? And you might be able to correlate that with some of your nice survey.
Yeah, we haven't done that, but that will be interesting. Thanks. Thanks. So doing this, in our first stage, we repeat our finding from the demand estimation. And here I'll just highlight that in the linear IV model, we see that property level sinking indeed significantly increases the probability of redevelopment as our kind of model predicted. And from our model consistent probit estimator, we get an estimate of the supply elasticity. So my last minute, I want to give us the final number from this project, which is plugging all of this into welfare. We estimate the subsidence cost Mexico City a total of $33.2 billion US, which annualized represents 0.9% of Mexico City's GDP. These costs are coming almost entirely from property managers making essentially bad investments. Although if we were to shut off sinking, which is what the red bars are showing you, both the developer and renters would also benefit slightly from the increased housing supply in the city in equilibrium. By contrast, if we were to eliminate information frictions and have rational expectations, we could achieve 12% of the gains of stopping subsidence in Mexico City. And the winners and losers here would look a bit different, with property managers benefiting again from having now correct expectations. But the developer and renters do not like this policy as it decreases developer profits in sinking areas and lowers overall rental supply in the city, which renters dislike. So in conclusion, we've conducted a comprehensive cost valuation of this groundwater externality for Mexico City. And more generally, our framework provides a way to think about how slow-moving disasters like sea level rise or climate change can affect housing markets, clarifying the different roles that realizations play from expectations in these markets. And our findings highlight that any friction that affects the capitalization of future risk in a home values will lead to too much value being put in risky areas, and which will amplify the cost of these externalities. Thank you.
Now lunch, but it's also, we will be showing in here an online webinar about sustainability in Bangladesh's garment sector. So I encourage you to stay and or grab some lunch and come back and watch the webinar. If, yeah, I just encourage you to do that.